Picture a cage built entirely out of beauty. Now fill it with girls who cannot leave it even when the building is on fire. Add lacquered combs worth more than a farmer's whole harvest, incense smoke thick enough to taste, and a moat so foul with blackened teeth dye and night soil that the locals call it the ditch of black teeth without even thinking it strange anymore. That's Yoshiwara, the licensed pleasure quarter of Edo in the early 1800s. Gorgeous from the street, airless from the inside. A place where a woman could be paraded past 300 admirers in a robe heavier than a suit of armour in the evening and beaten in a back room for crying too loudly about it by midnight. We're going back there tonight. Not as tourists gawking at the lanterns and the willow tree everyone takes prints of. We're living it. One day, one boy, inside the wooden walls of the only pleasure district the shogunate ever bothered to legalize, everything he would have seen, smelled, heard, and survived. So I make these history stories, and I genuinely don't know if anyone falls asleep to them, or if you're all just curious about how bad things used to get for people who had no choice in the matter. Either way, get comfortable. Here we go. Your eyes open into a square of grey light, and for half a second you don't know where you are. Then you hear her. Through the thin wall behind your head, a girl is crying, trying very hard not to be heard, which is somehow worse than if she screamed. That's how every morning starts in this house, not with birdsong, with someone else's grief, muffled through cheap pine boards, and you lying there pretending you don't hear it because there is nothing you can do about it anyway. The smell comes next. It always does. Cold ash from last night's brazier, the sweetish rot of old face powder ground into the floor mats, lamp oil, and underneath all of it the river mud stink of the moat that surrounds this whole quarter like a leash. You've stopped noticing your own smell a long time ago. Boy sweat and wood smoke. Nobody here smells like a temple garden, whatever the songs claim. You are Kichihei, 15 years old, son of a tenant farmer from a village 2 days northeast of Edo, and you have been a wakai mono, an errand boy, in the house called Tameya for 1 year and 4 months. You arrived with a paper sack of barley, a spare loincloth, and a debt that was never yours to begin with, signed by your father's hand against 3 years of your labour. Back home they told you Yoshiwara would make a man of you. They were not exactly wrong. They were not exactly right either. The bell at the great gate has already rung the hour. You can hear it even through walls, even through the crying. A low bronze note that rolls across the whole quarter and tells every house, every kitchen, every locked door that the day has officially begun, whether anyone inside is ready for it or not. You sit up on the thin futon, joints stiff from sleeping on a floor that never quite warms even in summer. Your roommate, a boy named Tora, 2 years older and already snoring like a man twice his size, doesn't stir. He came from a fishing village and has the build for hauling things, which is exactly why the house keeps him. You're smaller, quicker, good with your hands and your mouth, which is why you run messages instead of carrying water barrels. The crying behind the wall has stopped. It always stops eventually. You've learned not to ask whose turn it was last night. You fold your sleeping robe, smooth the thin mat as best you can, and pull on the same indigo work coat you've worn since spring, patched twice at the elbow by your own clumsy stitching. There is no basin of warm water waiting for you. You break the skin of ice on the rain barrel in the courtyard with the heel of your hand, and the cold bites all the way up to your shoulder before you've even splashed your face. You do it anyway. Appearances matter less for you than for the women upstairs. But Okio-san notices a dirty boy faster than she notices almost anything else. Okio-san is the Yaret, the house manager, and she is the closest thing you have to a master, though nobody calls her that to her face. She's somewhere past 50, small-boned, with a face like a dried plum and hands that have slapped more faces than you can count, including yours, twice in your first month, before you learned the rhythm of this place. She's already in the front room when you come down, kneeling beside the long brazier, counting yesterday's receipts by lamplight, even though the sun is technically up. Her fingers move over the abacus beads with a speed that still amazes you. Click, click, click. Numbers you'll never be trusted to understand fully. Debts owed by the house to the wholesalers, debts owed by the women to the house, debts that somehow never seem to shrink no matter how many nights pass. "You're late," she says, without looking up. "You're not late." She says this most mornings. You've learned not to argue because arguing only makes her find something for you to do that takes twice as long. Sweep the entrance first, then the lattice windows front and side, every bar of them, until you can see your own ugly face in the wood. Lord Sano's men are coming through this evening to look the girls over for the autumn viewing, and I will not have this house looking like a roadside inn. Yes, Okio-san. And wake Hanaogi. Gently. She had a hard night. You already knew that. You'd heard it. The lattice windows are the first thing any visitor sees of Tamaya. 2 long rows of wooden bars facing the main street, behind which the lower-ranked women sit on display every evening like fish laid out at a market stall, available for inspection by any man with the coin to stop and look. Cleaning those bars is the kind of work that ages your hands faster than it should. The wood is soft with age and constant handling, and it splinters if you scrub it wrong, so you have learned to go slow, with a damp cloth wrapped twice around your palm, working each bar from top to bottom, until the grain shows clean and pale under the grey morning light. Your knuckles are already cracked from the cold water. You flex them between bars, feeling the small stinging pull of skin that hasn't healed from yesterday's work, and you keep going, because the lattice will not clean itself, and Okio-san's patience has never once outlasted a slow morning. Hanaogi's room is at the end of the upstairs corridor, the good end, the end with a proper paper screen instead of a curtain, because Hanaogi is the house's reigning oiran, its highest-ranked courtesan, the one whose name is painted on banners outside during the cherry season, and whose processions down the main street stop foot traffic for the better part of an hour. She's 22 years old, which around here counts as already aging, and she has been in this house since she was 7, sold first as a komuro, a child attendant, then trained up through the ranks the way you might train a falcon, patiently, expensively, with a great deal riding on the outcome. You knock twice on the frame, soft, the way Okio-san taught you. "Hanaogi-sama, morning has come." Nothing for a long moment. Then a voice, rough with sleep and something else. "I heard the bell, Kichi. I'm not dead. Okio-san asked me to check on you after last night." A pause longer than the first one. Last night was a guest who didn't understand the word no means no, even when it's dressed up in pretty language. Tell her I'm fine. Tell her the swelling will be gone before the lanterns go up. You don't ask which part of her is swollen. You've learned which questions buy you nothing but trouble. "Yes, Hanaogi-sama." "Kichi." "Yes." "Bring me cold water for my eyes before you do anything else today. Cold as you can find it." You bring her the water yourself, in a chipped lacquer bowl, sliding the screen open only the width of your arm so you don't see more than you're meant to. Her face in the dim light is swollen along one cheekbone. Not badly, not visibly enough to matter for the autumn viewing, but enough that you understand why she wanted ice instead of warmth. She takes the bowl without looking at you and presses a folded cloth, already wet, against her face. "Thank you," she says, and for one strange second she sounds almost like an older sister, rather than the most famous courtesan north of the Great Gate. Then the door slides shut, and she is Hanaugi again, untouchable, a name on a banner. Breakfast for the wakaimono is rice gruel, thin, with a few shreds of pickled radish, if the kitchen woman is feeling generous, eaten standing in the narrow kitchen passage because there isn't room for boys to sit while the real work of the house gets done around them. You eat fast, the gruel barely warm, grains sliding down before you've properly chewed them, because Okio-san has already called your name twice from the front room, which means there's an errand waiting, and errands don't wait for empty bowls. "Take this to the wig maker on Kiyomachi," she says, pressing a folded paper into your hand, a list of orders for the autumn viewing, 3 new wigs and a repair on a 4th. "And don't dawdle at the gate watching the inspectors. You've seen it 100 times. You haven't seen it 100 times. You've seen it perhaps 30, and it has not gotten boring yet." Outside, Nakanocho, the main street of the quarter, is just beginning to wake into its daytime rhythm, which looks almost nothing like the evening rhythm everyone outside these walls imagines when they hear the word Yoshiwara. By night, this street is lanterns and silk and music drifting out of tea-house windows. By morning, it is delivery carts and sleepy attendants and the smell of yesterday's incense gone stale, mixed with the green sharpness of the willow trees that line the centre of the road. Planted there, people say, so the women inside the houses would have something living and growing to look at, something that wasn't lattice wood or painted screens. The willow nearest the great gate is the oldest one, thick-trunked, its branches trailing almost to the ground, and there is a saying among the wakemono that you haven't truly served a year in the quarter until you've stood under that tree at least once and admitted to yourself, quietly, that you don't know how to leave. You don't stop under it today. You have wigs to collect. The great gate itself, the Omen, rises at the northern end of the street, a single-roofed gateway of black timber that is the only formal entrance to the entire quarter, set into a wall and a moat that ring the whole district like a noose drawn loosely around a wrist. Guards stand there morning, noon and night, not to keep outsiders from entering. Anyone with coin may enter, but to keep certain people from leaving. Women under contract are not permitted through the gate without written permission stamped by the house that owns their debt. And the men posted there have seen every trick a desperate girl might try. Hidden in a palanquin, dressed as a delivery boy, wrapped in a roll of bedding meant for the laundry house outside. They've seen all of it, and they are paid specifically to see through it. You pass beneath the gate's shadow with your paper of wig orders held tight in one fist, nodding to a guard who has known your face for over a year now and barely glances at you, because boys like you are not the ones anyone worries about escaping. The wig-maker's shop on Kiyomachi is small, low-ceilinged, thick with the smell of camellia oil and human hair. Real hair, donated or sold by women who needed money more than they needed their own beauty, sorted now into baskets by colour and length along one wall. The old woman who runs it, Ofuji, used to be a courtesan herself decades ago, in a house that burned down twice and was finally torn apart by debt the 3rd time, and she likes to talk while she works. Mostly because nobody else in the quarter has the patience to listen to her anymore. 3 wigs and a repair, you say, holding out Okio-san's paper. She doesn't look at the paper. She already knows what Tamaya ordered. She's been doing this trade for 40 years, and her memory for orders outlasts most people's memory for their own children's birthdays. Instead, she looks at your hands, cracked red from the cold lattice cleaning, and sees through the gap where she's missing a tooth. You're working those hands too hard for a boy your age. It's the cold water, Ofuji-san. Okio-san wants the lattice clean for the inspectors tonight. The autumn viewing. She says it the way you might say the name of a disease that comes around every year whether you want it or not. I remember my own autumn viewings. Lord Sano's grandfather used to come through, you know. Looked exactly the same as the grandson does now, walks the same too, hands folded behind his back like he's inspecting horses instead of girls. She wraps the first wig in oiled paper, her fingers moving with a precision that has nothing to do with her age and everything to do with 40 years of repetition. You ever wonder what happens to a woman in this place once the men stop calling her beautiful, she asks, not really expecting an answer. I'll tell you since nobody else will. If she's clever and lucky and the house likes her enough, she ends up doing something like this. Wigs, sewing, teaching the new girls how to walk in those robes without falling over. If she isn't clever, or isn't lucky, or the house decides she costs more to keep than she earns, she ends up outside the wall in a place with no license and no rules at all, where the rates are lower and the men are rougher and nobody bothers writing your name on a banner. Is that true for everyone? Everyone who isn't bought out by some merchant fool enough to fall in love with a face he saw through a lattice window. She ties off the paper with a length of cord. It happens, once in 100 women maybe. The songs only ever tell you about the one. Nobody writes a ballad about the other 99. She hands you the bundle, then catches your wrist before you can turn away. Her grip surprisingly strong for hands that look so frail. Listen to me, boy. You're young enough that this place hasn't finished deciding what kind of man you'll be. Some boys grow up here and become gentle, because they've seen enough cruelty to want no part of adding to it. Others grow up here and become exactly like the men who walk these streets at night thinking they own whatever they're looking at. You understand? I think so, Fuji-san. Try to be the first kind. The world has enough of the second kind already, and this quarter manufactures them faster than it manufactures silk robes. You carry the wigs back through streets that are filling now with the daytime business of the quarter. Palanquin bearers resting their poles against shop fronts, kitchen boys hauling baskets of fish and vegetables toward the tea-house back doors, an old monk who comes through every few days to chant sutras at the gate of the small shrine wedged between 2 brothels, as if a few prayers might balance out whatever happens here after dark. Nobody pays him much attention. The shrine's offering box rattles with coins anyway. People here are devout in the particular way of those who know exactly how much luck they need and exactly how little they're likely to get. Back at Tameya, the afternoon belongs to preparation. The lattice windows you cleaned this morning will need to be reset with cushions and braziers before evening, so the women sitting behind them through the cold hours don't shiver visibly in front of paying customers, because a shivering woman reminds a man too much of the fact that she is cold and unhappy and exactly as human as he is. And that is not the illusion anyone in this business is selling. You help carry the cushions, help light the braziers, help drag the heavy outer screens into position, your back aching by mid-afternoon in a low, persistent way you've stopped noticing as separate from the rest of your body. Tora works beside you without much talking. The two of you moving through the routine the way two oxen might move through a familiar furrow, not from love of the work, but because the work has to happen and there's nobody else small enough or cheap enough to do it. The lanterns go up at dusk, and this is the moment Yoshiwara stops being a collection of tired wooden buildings and becomes for a few hours the most dazzling street in Japan. You are the one who lights the row outside Tamaya, working down the line with a long taper, touching flame to wick after wick until the whole front of the house glows amber against the darkening sky. Up and down Nakanocho, other boys are doing the same thing in front of other houses, and the effect, when you stop for one breath at the end of your row and actually look, is something that makes your chest tighten despite everything you know about what the light is covering up. Hundreds of lanterns, thousands maybe, strung along eaves and gate posts and the slim trunks of the willow trees, throwing a warm gold haze over the whole street that makes even the mud between the cobblestones look, for a moment, like something out of a woodblock print rather than a place where people sleep three to a room and cry behind thin walls. The lattice windows fill now. Hanaogi is not in the lattice tonight. Her rank exempts her from the lower display, but you can see the second and third ranked women of the house arranging themselves behind the bars, robes folded just so, faces powdered to a smoothness that erases every trace of the night before, sitting in postures that have been drilled into them since childhood, chin slightly down, eyes slightly raised, an expression that says come closer without a single muscle appearing to move. Men begin filling the street in numbers now, merchants who've closed their shops for the evening. Samurai who are technically forbidden from carrying their longswords inside the quarter and have left them with attendants at the gate. A scattering of younger sons with too much money and no land to inherit. They walk slowly in twos and threes, pausing at this lattice and that one, commenting on faces the way you might comment on melons at a market stall, and the women behind the bars hold their practiced expressions through every comment, every laugh, every crude joke passed between strangers about which face they'd buy if they had the coin. Tonight, though, the real spectacle isn't the lattice windows. Tonight Hanaogi is making her evening procession from Tamaya to the tea house, where she'll receive her chosen guest, and that procession, the dochu, stops Nakanocho dead for the better part of 20 minutes. You've seen it perhaps 50 times now, and it has never once failed to take something out of you. Some mixture of awe and a quieter feeling you don't have a good word for. Something closer to grief than admiration. Hanaogi steps out into the lantern light wearing an outer robe so heavy with gold thread and layered silk that it takes 2 attendants just to arrange the train of it properly behind her, the whole garment weighing, you'd guess, somewhere near what you weigh yourself. Her hair has been built up and pinned with combs and ornamental pins until it looks less like hair and more like an entire structure balanced on her skull, each pin chosen and placed by a hairdresser who spent the better part of 2 hours on the arrangement alone. Her face, beneath all of it, is the swollen cheek from this morning, hidden now under powder so expertly applied that you, who saw the bruise yourself at dawn, can barely find the trace of it. She walks in a figure-8 pattern unique to the highest-ranked Oiran. A slow rolling step on towering black lacquered clogs that lift her several inches above the crowd. 2 Kamuro, child attendants no older than 7 or 8, walking just ahead of her in matching small robes, and 2 senior attendants flanking her sides to keep the crowd from pressing too close. The whole procession moves at the pace of a funeral, except everyone watching is smiling, craning, calling out compliments, throwing small coins that the Kamuro are trained to ignore completely. You stand near the edge of the crowd with the wig bundle still under your arm, having been sent out again on some errand that has already slipped your mind because watching this has driven everything else temporarily out of your head, and you find yourself doing the thing a Fuji warned you about without meaning to, wondering what it costs a person to be looked at like that every single night by hundreds of strangers who have decided collectively that her entire worth as a human being can be measured in the elegance of her walk. One of the Kamuro stumbles slightly on a loose cobblestone, catches herself, and you see Hanaoki's eyes flick down toward the child for half a second. Something in her face that isn't part of the practiced expression at all. Something almost maternal and entirely involuntary, gone again before anyone in the crowd could possibly have noticed it. You noticed it. You've worked in this house long enough to know what to look for. The procession reaches the tea house, disappears through its doorway in a final rustle of silk, and the crowd breaks apart into smaller groups, drifting toward other houses, other lattices, other lanterns, the street swallowing the moment whole and moving on to the next spectacle as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. Because in Yoshiwara this happens every night, and a miracle performed nightly stops counting as a miracle to anyone except the people forced to perform it. Inside Tamaya, the real work of the evening has only just begun, and it has almost nothing to do with the beauty you watched parade down the street 20 minutes ago. You're sent to the kitchen passage to help carry trays, plates of grilled fish and pickled vegetables, and small flasks of warmed sake, destined for the upstairs rooms where guests are now arriving in a steady trickle. Men who paid handsomely simply for the privilege of being announced at the door, and led up the narrow staircase to whichever woman they'd requested by name. The trays are heavier than they look, and you carry 2 at a time upstairs that creak under every step, careful not to let so much as a drop of sake slosh over the lip of its flask, because Ukiyo-san inspects every tray that goes up and sends back anything imperfect, and a sent-back tray means you've wasted both the food and the time. 2 things this house treats as nearly identical in value. On the second landing, you nearly collide with one of the Kamuro, the same small girl who stumbled during the procession, hurrying the other direction with an empty tray of her own, and you see immediately that she's been crying, not the controlled decorative tears that sometimes get performed for sympathetic guests, but the real kind, the kind that leaves a child's whole face raw and swollen and unable to hide anything at all. "What happened?" you ask, keeping your voice low. "Nothing," she says, which is what everyone in this house says when something has very much happened. You find out anyway, later, from Tora, who heard it from one of the older attendants. The girl had stumbled during the procession, just that small visible misstep on the cobblestone, and Ukiyo-san had decided that a Kamuro, who stumbles in public during her Oiran's dochu, reflects badly on the whole house, badly enough to warrant a sharp strike across the back of the legs with a thin bamboo switch, 3 times, delivered in the privacy of the storeroom where guests wouldn't hear it. You think about the way Hanaogi's eyes flick down toward the child during the procession itself, that flash of something almost maternal, and you wonder if she knows yet what happened after, and what she would do about it even if she did know, given that she herself answers to Ukiyo-san in nearly every matter that doesn't involve which guests she's willing to receive. This is the part of Yoshiwara that never makes it into the prints sold to tourists outside the gate. Not the lanterns, not the silk. This, a 7-year-old child beaten for tripping on a loose cobblestone while performing a role she never once chose for herself, in service of an illusion that exists entirely for the comfort of grown men who will never know her name and would not particularly care if they did. You carry your trays. You don't say anything to anyone about what you think of it, because there is nobody in this house whose job it is to listen to what a 15-year-old errand boy thinks about anything, and because saying it out loud has never once, in your year and 4 months here, changed a single outcome for the better, later, near midnight, after most of the trays have gone up and most of the noise from the upper rooms has settled into the low murmur of conversation and occasional laughter that means the evening's business has shifted from arrival to something quieter, you find yourself sent back to Hanaogi's room with a fresh pot of tea, her guest having apparently requested it himself rather than more sake. She receives the tray at the screen door, her swollen cheek now fully hidden under fresh powder, applied sometime during the evening. The heavy outer robe replaced by something lighter, more comfortable, meant for the hours after the official performance has ended and only the private transaction remains. "You watched the procession tonight," she says, not a question. "Yes, Hanaogi-sama." "What did you think?" You hesitate because there is no safe answer to this question, only varying degrees of dishonesty. "It was beautiful," you say finally, which is true and also entirely insufficient. She almost smiles. "It's supposed to be beautiful. That's the whole design of it. You make something so beautiful that nobody in the crowd stops to ask what it cost the person performing it." She takes the tea tray from your hands. "I was sold to this house when I was 7 years old, Kichi. Exactly the age of the Kamuro who stumbled tonight. My debt, as it was originally written, was meant to be paid off in 10 years. It has been 15 years, and according to Okio-san's accounting, I am further from freedom now than I was when I started, because every robe I'm required to wear, every comb in my hair, every meal I eat that isn't kitchen gruel, gets added to what I owe. Is that true for everyone in a house? It's true for nearly everyone in every house in this quarter. The lucky ones get bought out by a patron who falls in love with a wrong face at the wrong moment. The rest of us simply get older and less valuable, and eventually we become a Fuji at the wig shop if we're fortunate, or we disappear entirely into one of the unlicensed districts outside the wall if we're not." She studies you for a moment in the lamplight. "You're a good boy, Kichi. Don't let this place finish raising you. Whatever you become when you leave here, try to be something other than what this place wants to make of you." It's nearly the same thing a Fuji told you that morning, in almost the same words, and you find yourself wondering how many people in this quarter have said some version of this same warning to some version of you, across however many years this place has been standing, and how many of those warnings actually took root in the boys who heard them. "Yes, Hanaogi-sama," you say, because it's the only answer you have, and you bow your way back out through the screen door into the corridor, where the smell of incense and lamp oil and the particular exhaustion of a long evening's labour follows you all the way back down the creaking stairs. By the time the last trays are cleared and the kitchen fire banked down for the night, you should be climbing straight up to the attic loft you share with Tora, and falling asleep the moment your head touches the thin pillow. Most nights that's exactly what happens. Tonight Tora has other ideas. "Come up to the watchtower," he says, already pulling his coat back on over the clothes he'd half undressed from. "Old Genbei's on duty. He lets me sit with him sometimes if I bring him something to drink." The fire watchtower, the Hainoban Yagura, rises above the rooftops near the rear of the quarter, a simple wooden platform on stilts manned through the night by rotating watchmen whose entire job is to scan the darkness for the first orange flicker of flame, because everyone in Yoshiwara, every single person who lives or works inside this walled district, understands in their bones that fire is the one disaster nobody here can fully prepare for. The buildings are packed shoulder to shoulder. Wood and paper and oiled cloth, heated through the winter with braziers and lanterns burning every single night without exception. And the quarter has already burned to the ground more times in living memory than most of its current residents care to count aloud. You climb the ladder behind Tora, palms cold against the rough rungs, and Genbei, a thick-set man with a face weathered the colour of old leather, grunts a greeting and accepts the small flask of sake Tora hands up to him without comment, as if this exchange happens often enough to need no explanation. From the platform the view stops you entirely. Below, Nakanocho still glows with lantern light, though thinner now, fewer pedestrians, the spectacle of evening settling into the quieter business of late night. Beyond the wall and the moat, the rest of Edo spreads out in the darkness, a vast uneven blanket of black rooftops broken here and there by the dim glow of another district's lanterns, another temple's eternal flame, the distant outline of the castle's stone walls catching the faintest edge of moonlight on the western horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond fields and rivers you've never crossed, is the village where your father is presumably still bent over the same rice paddies he was bent over the day you left, having no real way of knowing whether his son still has all his fingers, let alone whether his son has glimpsed even once anything resembling the world's actual size. They say on a clear day you can see the mountain from up here, Genbei says, gesturing vaguely west, though tonight there's nothing but darkness and a thin smear of cloud where a mountain might theoretically be hiding. Fuji. Never seen it myself, not from this exact spot, though I've heard plenty of men swear they have. Probably just wanted an excuse to sound poetic about a job that mostly involves staring at nothing for 6 hours straight. Has the quarter really burned down as many times as people say, you ask? Genbei laughs, low and without much humour in it. More? I was a boy myself, the last big one. Maybe your age, maybe younger. Whole quarter gone in under 2 hours. Wind was wrong that night, caught the flame and carried it roof to roof faster than anyone could run a bucket line. They rebuilt within a year, of course. Always do. Too much money flowing through this place for the shogunate to let it stay ash for long. What happens to the women during a fire? The ones under contract? Genbei's expression shifts slightly, the easy humour draining out of it. Depends on the house. Some owners are decent enough to throw the doors open the second smoke's spotted and let everyone run for the gate. Some owners worry more about losing their investment than losing their workers, and they've been known to keep doors locked a little longer than they should, just to make sure nobody uses the chaos as an excuse to slip out past the wall for good. I've heard stories. I won't say which ones are true and which ones are just stories men tell to scare apprentices like you two. You think about Haneogi's voice from earlier. 15 years against an original 10-year debt, further from freedom now than when she started, and you wonder, with a coldness that has nothing to do with the night air, exactly how decent Tamaya's particular owners might prove to be if smoke ever filled that staircase. You don't say any of this aloud. Tora is already half asleep against the railing, the sake having done its quiet work on him, and Genbei has gone back to scanning the dark rooftops with the patient, half-bored attention of a man who has spent enough nights up here to know that most nights nothing happens at all. Most nights. You climb back down before your fingers go fully numb, leaving Tora to doze against Genbei's shoulder until someone eventually wakes him, and you walk the last stretch back toward the attic alone, past the rear wall of the quarter where, if you stood on tiptoe and looked through a gap in the boards, You could glimpse the unlicensed district that has grown up just outside the official boundary, a scattering of low huts and lean-to brothels with no banners, no lanterns worth mentioning, no license from the shogunate, and therefore no protection from it either. Ofuji's words come back to you unbidden. The other 99 women nobody writes ballads about. You don't look through the gap tonight. You've looked before, and what you saw wasn't anything you needed to see again before sleep. Sleep comes hard and fast that night, the way it always does after a long day of trays and lattice wood and cold rain barrel water, and the next morning arrives exactly the same as the one before it. The bell at the great gate, the crying through the wall, though tonight it's a different girl's turn and the whole cycle simply starts again. The weeks pass the way water passes over the same stretch of riverbed, wearing the same grooves a little deeper each time without ever looking on any single day, like it's changing anything at all. Autumn deepens. The willow leaves along Nakanocho go from green to a tired yellow, and finally to nothing. Bare branches trailing over a street that keeps right on glowing gold every evening, regardless of what season the calendar claims. You learn the particular ache of cold mornings, made worse by wind funneling down the narrow alleys between houses. Learn which of the kitchen women will slip you an extra scoop of rice if you compliment her cooking. Convincingly enough, learn that Okio-san's bad moods cluster reliably around the days just before the wholesalers come to collect on the house's own debts, which makes a strange kind of sense once you think about it. Everyone in this quarter owes someone. The debt simply flows downhill, and you're standing fairly near the bottom of that particular slope. Hanaogi's bruise fades and is replaced eventually by others, though never visibly, never anywhere the powder can't reach. The Kamuro, who was struck for stumbling, grows half an inch taller and learns to walk the cobblestones without tripping, because children in this place learn quickly, or they learn painfully, often both at once. Tora gets promoted slightly, taking on more of the heavy carrying work as a new boy arrives from somewhere south to fill the bottom rung he's leaving behind. A small skinny child who flinches at every loud noise the same way you once did, though you can't quite remember now exactly when you stopped flinching yourself. Winter settles in hard by the new year, and this is the season everyone in the quarter speaks of with a particular wariness that you didn't fully understand your first winter here, but understand completely now. Cold air means dry air. Dry air means every brazier, every lantern, every careless spark from a kitchen fire carries weight it wouldn't carry in the damp of summer. The wooden buildings, packed so tightly together that you could nearly reach from one rooftop to the next, sit through these months like kindling stacked and waiting, and everyone from Okio-san down to the newest Kamuro moves through the season with one ear permanently tuned for the particular clanging pattern of the fire bell, a sound distinct from the hour bell, sharper, faster, designed to be unmistakable even from a sound sleep. You've heard that bell ring twice this winter already, both times for small fires caught early in neighbouring houses, snuffed out before they could spread past a single room. Both times you stood in the courtyard in the freezing dark with your heart hammering against your ribs, waiting for news. And both times the news came quickly enough that you were back in your futon within the hour, shivering, telling yourself it was only the cold keeping you awake afterward. The third time is different. It is the deep middle of the night, the hour when even the latest guests have either left or fallen asleep in their borrowed rooms, when you wake to a smell that your body recognizes a full breath before your mind catches up to it. Not wood smoke from a banked kitchen fire. Something sharper, hungrier, already too thick in the air to be coming from anywhere contained. You sit up so fast your head spins. Beside you, the new boy, the skinny one from the south, whose name you've only just learned is Sota, is already awake too, eyes huge in the dark. Kichi, Kichi, do you smell that? You're moving before you've fully decided to move, scrambling toward the small attic window, and through the cracks around its frame you can see it. An orange flicker against the underside of the clouds 2 streets over, growing even as you watch. Not the contained glow of a single brazier, but something already climbing, already spreading roof to roof the way Zhenbei described it that night on the watchtower. Wind catching the flame and carrying it faster than anyone can outrun it on foot. The fire bell starts then, that sharp, fast clanging, utterly different from the slow toll of the hour, and within seconds the whole house is awake around you. Footsteps pounding on stairs, voices shouting names, somewhere below a woman screaming a single word over and over that you can't quite make out through the wall. You and Sota half fall down the attic ladder, and the smell hits you fully now, acrid and thick, catching in the back of your throat. And through the small window at the end of the corridor you can see flame already visible above the rooftops to the east. Close. Far closer than 2 streets feels like it should be. Okio-san is at the bottom of the stairs, and for one disorienting moment you see something on her face you've never seen there before. Not anger, not the brisk efficiency she usually wears like armour, but something closer to genuine fear, which is somehow more frightening than anything else happening around you. Get the girls moving. All of them now, downstairs, out the front. Do not stop for robes, do not stop for combs. Move. You take the stairs 2 at a time, pounding on door after door, shouting names, dragging half-dressed women out of rooms thick with sleep and confusion. And it's in the 2nd floor corridor that you find the problem Zhenbei warned you about, without ever quite saying it outright. The side door, the one that leads to the narrow alley behind the house, the shortest route toward the rear gate, is bolted. Not jammed. Bolted deliberately, the heavy iron bar dropped into its brackets the way it is every single night. Because that door leads toward the unlicensed district outside the wall, and a house that loses its inventory through an unlocked back door during the chaos of a fire is a house that loses money. It can never recover. And somebody, weeks ago, decided that risk mattered more than the 30 extra seconds it might cost a panicking person to find the bar. You wrench at the bolt with both hands. It doesn't move. Your palms are already raw from the cold, cracked skin of a winter's worth of lattice cleaning, and the iron bites into the cracks like fresh injury, and still you pull, throwing your whole weight against it, while behind you a cluster of women in thin sleeping robes presses closer, the smoke already curling visibly along the corridor ceiling. Somebody's coughing, turning ragged and frightened. The front, you gasp, abandoning the bolt. The front door, it's not blocked. Go now. You heard them back the way they came, shouting over the rising noise, smoke thickening with every passing second. And somewhere in the scramble you find Hanaogi. No robes at all. Just a thin underlayer and bare feet. One arm wrapped tight around the Kamuro who stumbled months ago. The small girl clinging to her with both fists. Kichi? Her voice is steadier than you'd expect, though her eyes are wide and white-rimmed in the dim corridor light. The Kamuro from the 3rd room, the youngest one, she's still in there. I can hear her crying, but the door won't. You don't wait for her to finish. You shoulder past, throw your whole body against a door that's stuck, not bolted, just swollen and jammed in its frame the way wood does in cold weather, and on the third try it gives so suddenly you nearly fall through it, into a small room where a child no older than 6 is curled in the corner, frozen, too terrified to move toward the noise and the smoke and the orange light now visible through the paper screen of the window. You scoop her up. She weighs almost nothing, light as a bundle of kindling herself, and she clings to your neck with a grip that will leave marks, and you carry her back into the corridor where Hanogi is waiting, where the air has gone from smoky to genuinely hard to breathe, where downstairs you can hear the front door finally thrown wide and the cold night air pouring in, along with the sound of dozens of voices shouting in the street beyond. The stairs are a crush of bodies, women half-dressed and screaming, attendants shoving past each other, and somewhere in the crowd you hear Okio-san's voice still cutting through everything. Move, move, do not stop. And you press the small girl's face against your shoulder so she doesn't have to see whatever is or isn't burning yet at the base of the stairs. And you go down with the current of bodies rather than against it, because fighting a crowd like this gets you trampled rather than free. Outside, the cold hits you like a wall, and the relief of breathable air is so sharp it almost hurts. The street is chaos. Nakanocho lit now by something other than lanterns, flame visible above roof lines 2 and 3 houses down, sparks riding the wind in long orange streaks that land on dry thatch and dry timber, and catch, again and again, faster than any bucket line could possibly keep pace with. You set the small girl down only once you've reached the far side of the street, well clear of Tamaya's front entrance, and she immediately attaches herself to the nearest adult leg, which happens to belong to one of the senior attendants, sobbing without words. You look back at the house. Smoke is pouring from the upper windows now, thick and black, underlit orange from somewhere inside that you don't want to think too hard about. Okio-san stands in the street counting heads, her composure visibly cracking with every name she has to call twice before getting an answer. And you realise, with a coldness that has nothing to do with the winter air, that you don't yet know whether everyone made it out. Hanaogi is there. The stumbling Kamuro is there, still clinging to her robe. Tora stumbles out moments later, soot-streaked, dragging the house's strong box of receipts because some habits of obedience apparently survive even genuine terror. Sota is there, shaking, having apparently gone out a different door entirely. But the girl from the wall behind your head, the one whose crying woke you that very first morning of this story, the one you never learned the name of because she had only arrived at the house 6 weeks earlier and you'd never once been properly introduced, she does not come out the front door. Nobody saw her on the stairs. Nobody can say, in the chaos and the shouting and the smoke now rolling thick across the whole street, exactly which room she'd been sleeping in that night, or whether anyone reached it before the fire did. You stand in the freezing street, watching Tamiya's roof catch fully now, flame breaking through the old grey shingles in a sound like tearing cloth, and you understand, in a way that has nothing to do with anything Fuji or Hanaogi or Genbei ever told you in words, exactly what this place costs the people who live inside it, and exactly how little that cost matters to the fire itself, which burns the beautiful and the ordinary and the powerful and the powerless with precisely the same indifferent hunger. The fire bell is still ringing somewhere behind you, joined now by others further down the street, a whole chorus of warning that arrived roughly 4 houses too late to matter. You spend what remains of the night in the temple courtyard near the gate, the small shrine wedged between 2 brothels that the old monk visits every few days, because it is the one open space in the quarter not currently on fire, and not yet so crowded with refugees from other houses that there's no room to stand. Someone has brought blankets. Someone else has brought a cauldron of water, set over a hastily built fire of its own, small and controlled and almost obscene in its calmness, compared to the chaos still visible above the rooftops 2 streets away. Hanaogi sits against the shrine's low wall with the stumbling Kamuro asleep against her side. The child finally exhausted past terror and into unconsciousness, and Hanaogi herself stares at nothing, her bare feet tucked under the hem of someone's borrowed coat, the powder long since sweated and smoke streaked off her face, so that for the first time since you've known her, she simply looks like what she is. A 22-year-old woman who has survived a great many things she never chose, sitting in the cold, waiting for dawn. You sit nearby, not close enough to intrude, close enough that she could speak to you if she wanted to. She doesn't. Not for a long while. Neither do you. The fire is brought under control sometime before dawn, having consumed Tamaya entirely and taken 3 neighbouring houses with it, before the wind finally died down, enough for the bucket lines to gain real ground. By the grey light of early morning you walk back with Okio-san and a handful of senior attendants to see what's left, and what's left is mostly char, blackened support beams standing at angles that have nothing to do with how they were built. The smell of wet ash so thick it coats the inside of your mouth. The body is found in the rubble near what had been the 3rd-floor corridor, close enough to a window that whoever finds her speculates quietly that she might have been trying to break through the paper screen when the smoke overcame her instead. You don't go close enough to see for yourself. You don't need to. You already knew somewhere in your chest from the moment nobody could say which room she'd been in. Nobody ever does learn her name properly, not even now. The house records list her only by the registration number assigned when her contract was purchased 6 weeks earlier from a broker in a fishing village somewhere along the coast. A girl traded for her family's unpaid debts, the same as you were. Except her debt got paid off completely differently than anyone intended. Paid off by fire instead of by years of labour, by smoke instead of silk. Okyo-san stands in front of the ruin for a long moment, and you watch her face cycle through several things before settling, finally, into the same brisk efficiency she wears every other day of her life, as if grief is simply another expense to be entered into the ledger and then closed out so the real business of the day can continue. We rebuild, she says, to nobody in particular and everyone at once. We've rebuilt before. The wholesalers will extend credit, they always do, there's too much money in this quarter for them not to. Hanogi, you and the others will be housed at the Matsuya for the time being. They've agreed to take over Flow. Kichi, Tora, you'll help with the clearing this morning, then go see if your wages have survived in the strongbox. She does not mention the girl with no name again. Not that morning, not in the weeks that follow. You understand, watching her walk briskly toward the temple to arrange the overflow housing, that this is not because she felt nothing. It's because feeling something and being able to afford the time to sit with that feeling are 2 entirely different luxuries. And Okio-san, like everyone else in this quarter, has never once been able to afford the second one. You spend the morning hauling charred timber into a cart, your hands, already cracked from a winter of cold water, now blistered fresh from heat that lingered in the wood longer than you expected. Tora works beside you in the same heavy silence you fell into the day after he first arrived here. 2 boys moving through labour because the labour has to happen, regardless of what either of you privately feels about the reason it needs doing. Tamiya rises again over the following months. the way Genbei said it would, the way Okio-san insisted it would, even while standing in front of the smoking ruin on that first grey morning. The wholesalers extend credit exactly as predicted, because there is too much money flowing through this quarter for anyone with capital to let a single fire interrupt the supply of it for long, and carpenters arrive within the week to begin clearing the last of the char and laying new foundation timbers across the same footprint the old house occupied, as if the ground itself has no memory of what happened there. You watch the new building go up plank by plank through the late winter and into early spring, the smell of fresh-cut cedar slowly replacing the lingering smell of smoke that seemed, for the first month at least, to have worked its way permanently into your own clothes and hair no matter how many times you washed. The new lattice windows go in last, fitted by a different craftsman than the one who built the originals, the wood pale and unweathered, and you find yourself assigned the job of cleaning them for the first time on the same week they're installed, running a damp cloth over bars that have never yet held a single splinter, that have never yet been touched by a winter's worth of cold water and complaint. It feels strange somehow, scrubbing wood that has no history yet. You almost miss the old bars, soft with age, worn smooth in places by years of women's hands resting against them while they waited behind the lattice for someone to choose their face out of all the faces on display. These new bars will get there eventually. Everything in this quarter gets there eventually, given enough nights and enough hands. Hanaogi returns to the rebuilt house once it's ready, her rank restored along with her old room, though something in the way she carries herself through that first procession back down Nakanocho strikes you as slightly different than before, a fraction more weight in her shoulders that has nothing to do with the robes. The stumbling Kimura has stopped stumbling entirely by now, has in fact grown nearly 2 inches over the winter, walking the cobblestones with the kind of careful confidence that only comes from having been punished enough times to learn precisely where every loose stone in the street happens to sit. Tora finishes his contracted years that spring, the debt his own family signed against him, finally settled in full, and on the morning he leaves, he stands in the courtyard with a small bundle of his own belongings, looking almost embarrassed by how little there is to carry after years of labour. "Journeyman now," he says, like he's still testing the word in his own mouth to see if it fits. "Going to work the docks at Shinagawa. Pays better. Hours are worse, but at least the work doesn't follow you up the stairs at night." You shake his hand the way you've seen merchants do outside the gate, an awkward gesture neither of you fully knows the etiquette for, and then he's gone, walking out through the great gate a free man in a way you won't be for another year and 8 months yet, and the attic feels strangely large that first night without his snoring filling the other half of it. A new boy arrives within the week to fill the empty space, younger than you were when you first came, 11 or 12 at most, from somewhere along the coast where his family apparently had even less to offer the world than yours did, and he flinches at every loud noise the exact same way you once did, the exact same way Tora must have, the exact same way every boy who's ever slept in that attic room presumably has, going back as far as the house's records bother to remember. It gets easier, you tell him, the first night, when he lies awake too overwhelmed by the strangeness of everything to fall asleep, despite his obvious exhaustion. Give it a season or two. You'll know the streets. You'll know which of Okio-san's moods to avoid and which ones are safe to be near. It starts to feel less like drowning and more like just swimming somewhere unfamiliar. He doesn't believe you yet. You can hear it in the careful way he doesn't answer. The same way you didn't quite believe Tora the first time he said something similar to you, a year and a half and one entire burned down building ago. but he will believe it eventually, probably around the same time he stops flinching, probably without even noticing the exact day it happens, the way you can't quite pinpoint the day it happened for yourself either. You've started noticing things about this place you never used to see. The way your Fuji's eyes track every wig she sells back through years of repeated customers. The way Okio-san's brisk efficiency cracks open by exactly one finger's width whenever a fire bell rings anywhere nearby, even months after the rebuild. The way Hanaogi's practiced expression behind the lattice or during a procession is built from dozens of small, specific muscle movements that took her years to learn and now perform themselves whether or not anything underneath them is actually calm. You're learning to read the quarter the way a Fuji reads hair, the way the Kamuro learned to read the cobblestones, the way Genbei reads smoke against clouds before anyone else on the ground even notices the smell. It's not the kind of knowledge anyone would put in a manual. It's the kind you absorb slowly through repetition, the way water wears a groove into stone without either one of them appearing to move at all from one single day to the next. Your hands have changed too. The cracks from cold water have become permanent, faint white lines across both palms that will probably never fully fade, even if you leave this quarter tomorrow. A record written into your own skin of every winter morning spent scrubbing lattice wood by rain barrel light. You catch yourself looking at them sometimes, in idle moments, the way you might look at a ledger you didn't choose to keep but have been keeping anyway, one entry at a time, for nearly 2 years now. Spring brings the cherry blossoms, and with them, one of the few days each year when Okio-san allows the Wakaimono something resembling actual freedom, because the whole quarter empties out for a few hours during the Asakusa Temple Festival. Guests and attendants alike draw northward to the great Cannon Hall and the market street surrounding it, and a boy underfoot in an empty house is less useful than a boy who can run an errand toward the festival and bring back word of which wholesalers are there and which goods are moving cheap. You walk out through the great gate with the new boy, whose name turns out to be Matsu, trailing half a step behind you the way you once trailed behind Tora. Both of you given a small handful of coins and strict instructions to return before the evening lanterns go up. The causeway leading away from the quarter, the Nihonzutsumi, runs straight as a sword cut through low rice paddies still flooded silver with spring water. Willows along its length not yet in full leaf, and walking it without an errand pressing at your back feels almost unfamiliar, like wearing someone else's shoes. You've made this walk dozens of times, carrying messages or escorting deliveries. You've never once made it simply to arrive somewhere for your own sake. Asakusa, when you reach it, is louder and more crowded than Nakanocho ever gets, even during the busiest evening. The narrow approach to the great Cannon Temple, lined on both sides with stalls selling everything a person could want, and several things nobody actually needs. Roasted sweet potatoes and paper toys and charms blessed for everything from safe childbirth to good fortune in trade. The whole crowd moving in a slow, shuffling current toward the temple gate, beneath the enormous red lantern hanging at its centre that you've heard described 100 times and somehow still underestimated in size until you're standing directly beneath it, craning your neck back like a country boy who's never seen anything larger than a barn door, which you realise with some amusement is more or less exactly what you still are underneath the 1.5 years of city Polish. Matsu buys himself a roasted sweet potato with his entire handful of coins within the first 10 minutes, and you let him, because you remember exactly how that felt the first time you had money of your own, and absolutely no practice spending it wisely. Near the temple's 5-story pagoda, An old man has set up a small stand selling protective charms, and something about his weathered face and the deliberate, unhurried way he arranges his goods reminds you enough of Zhenbei that you find yourself drifting toward his stall without quite deciding to. Charm for safety, young man. Good for travellers. Good for anyone who works near fire, given the season. How did you know I work near fire? He smiles, gap-toothed, not unkind. Everyone who comes from that direction works near fire one way or another. The wall and the moat don't keep the smell of smoke off a person's collar quite as well as people think. You buy a charm mostly out of politeness, though some smaller part of you genuinely wants the protection it claims to offer, given what you watched happen to a girl with no name barely 4 months ago. Climb up if you want a proper view, the old man says, nodding toward a tea house built into the rising ground just beyond the pagoda, its second floor open on one side to catch the breeze. Best vantage in the district. They won't mind a boy looking so long as he doesn't block the paying customers. You leave Matsu happily working through a second sweet potato near the temple steps and climb the narrow stairs to the tea house's upper floor, and the view, when you reach it, stops you mid-step the same way the lantern-lit procession down Nakanocho once stopped you, though for entirely different reasons. Edo spreads out below in every direction, rooftops stretching further than you can properly measure. The wide grey ribbon of the Sumida River curving past with boats moving along it in both directions, sails and oars and the occasional grand barge with curtained cabins for passengers, wealthy enough to avoid walking anywhere at all. Far to the southwest you can just make out the dark mass of the castle's outer walls, and beyond everything, faint against the pale spring sky, the unmistakable white-capped silhouette of the mountain Zhenbei once admitted he'd never quite managed to see from the watchtower himself. You can see Yoshiwara too, or near enough, a distant cluster of rooftops behind its own moat and wall, small from up here, almost ordinary, indistinguishable at this distance from any other crowded district in the city, except for the particular shape the wall and the moat trace around it, a deliberate boundary drawn by men who decided generations ago exactly which kind of commerce needed fencing in and which kind didn't. From this height, the whole arrangement looks less like a place and more like a single deliberate decision made once by someone with enough power to make it, and then maintained ever since by hundreds of smaller decisions made by hundreds of smaller people. Okio-san's ledger and Ofuji's wig baskets, and the iron bolt on a side door that someone weeks before the fire decided mattered more than 30 extra seconds of a frightened person's life. You think about the girl with no proper name, whose registration number you could probably still find if you asked, and you think about how small her entire world was, contained inside that wall and that moat, inside 6 weeks of a contract she never signed herself, and you think about how enormous the world actually is when you're standing somewhere high enough to see past your own walls for once, river and castle and mountain, and 1,000 rooftops belonging to people whose lives never once touched hers and never will. It doesn't fix anything, this view. It doesn't bring her back or unlock that bolted door after the fact, or make Okio-san's ledger any less indifferent to what it costs to keep it balanced. But it does something else, something quieter, something closer to what Hanogi might have meant when she told you not to let this place finish raising you. It reminds you that the wall around Yoshiwara, the wall that feels, from inside, like the entire boundary of the known world, is in fact one small fence among countless others, visible from up here as nothing more than a single thin dark line cutting across a much larger picture that keeps going in every direction, long after the eye gives up trying to follow it. "Quite a thing, isn't it?" says a voice beside you, and you turn to find an old woman has climbed the stairs as well, leaning on a stick, dressed plainly, but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who carried herself very differently in an earlier decade of her life. I worked in that district myself, 40 years past now. Different house, long since torn down and rebuilt, I don't know how many times since. Did you ever come up here back then? Once a year, if I was lucky and my house's mistress was feeling generous. It never got less strange looking down at the place from outside it. Every time I'd think, surely it isn't really that small. Surely the thing that swallows my whole life whole every single day can't possibly look like a child's toy from up on a hill. She shakes her head slowly, and every time it did, looked exactly that small. Took me years to understand what that meant. What did it mean? That the wall was never as tall as it felt from inside. That most of what kept me there wasn't timber and stone at all. It was debt and habit, and not knowing where else in the world I might go, even if the gate stood wide open. She looks at you with an expression that has something of a Fuji in it. Something of Hanaoji too. The particular patience of people who learned things the hard way and have decided late in life that passing the lesson along cost them nothing and might cost you less than it cost them. You're young yet. Whatever debt brought you in through that gate, it will end eventually one way or another. Make sure that when it does, you remember what the world looks like from up here, and not just what it looked like from behind that wall. You stay at the railing a long while after she's gone, until the sun has shifted enough that you know Matsu will be wondering where you've disappeared to, and then you start back down the narrow stairs. The charm from the old man's stall tucked into your sleeve, the whole wide grey river, and the small distant cluster of Yoshiwara's rooftop still sitting somewhere behind your eyes the rest of the walk home. Not every guest who passes through the great gate comes for an evening's gentle illusion. Some come already angry, already drunk, already convinced that the silk and the lanterns and the painted faces exist solely to be torn through, and it falls to boys like you, more often than anyone outside the wall would guess, to stand between that kind of anger and the women it's aimed at. It happens on a humid evening in early summer. The air so thick and still that even the willow leaves along Nakanocho hang motionless. No breeze at all to carry off the smell of sweat and incense in the river beyond the moat, which by this season has gone properly foul. The heat working on its black water, the way heat works on anything left standing too long. The man arrives at Tameya already unsteady on his feet, a minor retainer to some provincial lord, the kind of guest Okiyo-san usually tries to discourage politely at the door, but cannot quite afford to turn away outright, given how few of his sort still bother spending coin in a house still rebuilding its reputation after the fire. He has requested one of the middle-ranked women, a courtesan named Kosen, 20 years old, quiet, good with her hands at needlework in the rare hours when she isn't required to be good with them at something else. You are sent up later that evening with a fresh flask of sake, your fourth trip up that particular staircase, and as you reach the top step you hear something through the thin wall that makes your whole body go cold before your mind has even finished identifying the sound. A slap, sharp and wet, followed by a woman's gasp cut short. You set the tray down outside the door, hands shaking slightly, and you do the thing every wakimono in every house in this quarter has been taught to do in exactly this situation, which is nothing visible at all. You go straight back downstairs and find Okiyo-san, because intervening yourself, a 15-year-old errand boy laying hands on a paying guest, however drunk and however cruel, would end your contract and very possibly end far worse than your contract. while reporting it to the one person in the house with actual authority to act, gives Kosen an actual chance at help arriving before real damage gets done. Okio-san moves fast when you tell her, faster than her usual brisk efficiency. Two of the largest male attendants the house keeps for precisely this purpose already climbing the stairs behind her before you've finished your sentence. The guest is removed within minutes, voice rising in outraged protest about money already paid and services not yet rendered to his satisfaction, hauled bodily down the back stairs and deposited none too gently in the street outside, his coin refunded only in part. A calculated insult Okio-san delivers with the same flat efficiency she applies to every other ledger entry in the house. Kosen has a split lip and a bruise already darkening along her jaw by the time you're allowed to bring her cold water, and she takes the bowl from your hands without comment, her eyes fixed somewhere past your shoulder, the particular blankness you've learned to recognize as the look of someone deciding, in real time, exactly how much of this evening she can afford to feel before tomorrow's guests arrive, expecting someone unbruised and unbothered. "Thank you for fetching Okio-san," she says finally, quiet. Not every house's boys would have known to go straight to her instead of trying to handle it themselves. "I didn't know what else to do. That was exactly the right thing to do. Remember it." She presses the cold cloth against her jaw, wincing. Some men come here to forget for an evening that they're small and powerless everywhere else in their lives. They want for a few hours to feel like the largest thing in the room. We're not allowed to be the largest thing in the room while they're paying for the privilege of feeling that way. It is an exhausting kind of arithmetic, Kichi. Figuring out exactly how small you need to make yourself to survive a guest like that one, without making yourself so small you disappear entirely. You think about a Fuji's warning, the two kinds of men this quarter manufactures, and you wonder, not for the first time, which kind tonight's guest had been before he ever set foot through the great gate, and which kind he'll go right on being tomorrow in whatever province he returns to, where presumably nobody named Okio-san stands ready to throw him bodily into the street. Summer settles deeper after that night, bringing with it a heat that makes the whole quarter feel like a single, slow-cooking pot, with the lid never quite lifted. The moat reeks badly enough by midsummer that even guests passing over the bridge at the great gate hold their sleeves to their noses, and inside the houses every room becomes an exercise in survivable discomfort. Paper screens propped open wherever modesty allows, women fanning themselves between guests in postures that have nothing elegant left in them once the lanterns are doused and nobody's watching. You learn to work the early mornings and the late evenings when the heat is bearable, and to move as little as possible through the brutal middle hours of the afternoon, when even Okio-san retreats to whatever shade the courtyard offers, rather than push the household through tusks that could wait for cooler air. Your indigo work coat, the same one you arrived in nearly 2 years ago, has gone thin and pale at the elbows from repeated washing, and sweat soaks through it by mid-morning most days, salt drying white along the collar by evening, a map of the day's labour written in your own dried perspiration, the same way winter wrote its own map in the cracked white lines across your palms. The cicadas start their endless droning sometime in early summer, and don't fully stop until well into autumn, a sound so constant you stop hearing it as separate from silence after the first few weeks. The way you stopped noticing your own smell. The way you've stopped noticing, mostly, how strange your life would look to the boy you were 2 years ago, standing in his father's rice paddy with no notion at all of lattice windows or lanterns, or the particular weight of carrying a sleeping 6-year-old down a smoke-filled staircase, Autumn arrives with rain that turns Nakanocho's packed earth into a thin grey soup, and you learn quickly to walk close along the building fronts where the ground sits slightly higher, carrying a stick to test the depth of puddles before stepping into them, because some of those puddles run ankle deep and some run deeper, and a wakimono who arrives at a customer's destination soaked to the knee earns nothing but complaints for his trouble. Your sandals never fully dry through the wettest weeks. You grow used to the particular cold, clammy discomfort of wet straw against your feet by mid-morning, a discomfort that has become so familiar it barely registers anymore as something worth complaining about, even to yourself. It's during this rainy stretch, on an unremarkable Tuesday, with no festival and no procession scheduled, that Okio-san calls the whole house together in the front room, an event rare enough that even the kitchen staff abandon their pots to listen. A patron has come forward to buy out Hanaogi's remaining contract in full. He's a wealthy rice merchant from the northern provinces, a widower somewhere past 40 who has been a regular and increasingly devoted guest of hers for the better part of a year. The kind of man a Fuji warned you about. The once-in-100 exception who falls in love with a face he first saw through wood and silk rather than circumstance, and who has, against every reasonable expectation, actually followed through on the promise such infatuation usually only produces in songs. The sum involved, Okio-san announces with the particular satisfaction of someone closing out a very profitable ledger entry, is substantial enough to settle not only the entirety of Hanaogi's debt, but a healthy bonus on top of it for the house's trouble in releasing her early. You watch Hanaogi's face while this is announced, and what you see there is not quite the joy you might have expected from someone hearing, after 15 years against an original 10-year contract, that her debt has finally, actually, completely ended. It's something more complicated than joy. Relief, certainly, visible in the way her shoulders drop a fraction, a tension you'd stopped noticing because she'd been carrying it for so long it simply read as posture rather than strain. But underneath the relief, something that looks almost like grief, and you understand it within a moment because you felt a smaller version of the same thing yourself, watching Tora walk out the great gate that spring morning, this strange morning for a life you're finally escaping, simply because it was still, undeniably, the only life you'd properly known. She leaves 3 days later, on a morning bright enough that the whole street seems freshly washed by the week's rain, dressed not in any of her elaborate working robes, but in something plain, almost severe, the kind of travelling clothes a merchant's wife might wear, and the contrast between this quiet, unremarkable departure and the thunderous, lantern-lit spectacle of her every evening procession strikes you as the truest thing you've ever seen happen inside these walls. She finds you in the courtyard before the palanquin arrives to carry her out through the great gate, for what both of you understand will be the final time. Kichi. She says your name the way she did that night with the tea tray, almost like an older sister rather than the most celebrated courtesan this house has produced in a generation. I won't get to see what becomes of you, whether you stay gentle, or whether this place finally wins and turns you into one of the other kind. I'll try to stay the first kind, Hanogi-sama. I believe you will. You carried a 6-year-old down a burning staircase without anyone ordering you to. That's not the kind of thing the second kind of man does, not even by accident. She reaches into her sleeve and presses something small and cool into your palm. A comb. Plain, undecorated. Nothing like the elaborate pieces that built up her hair for every procession you ever watched her make down this street. My first comb. The one I had before this house ever owned a single hair on my head. I've kept it 15 years for no reason I can properly explain. I think I'd like you to have it now, for reasons I also can't properly explain, except that you're the only person in this house who ever once looked at me and saw something other than the name painted on the banner outside. You don't know what to say to that, so you say nothing at all, and she seems to understand that silence is the correct response, because she simply nods once, straightens, and walks toward the waiting palanquin with the same rolling, deliberate grace she's performed every single night for years. Except this time there's no crowd watching, no lanterns lit, no Kamuro walking ahead of her. Just an empty street still damp from the week's rain, and a boy standing in a courtyard holding a 15-year-old comb that suddenly feels heavier in your hand than anything else you've carried in 2 years of carrying things for other people. Without Hanaogi, the house feels strange for weeks. The way a room feels strange after a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing gets removed from it, and you find the rhythm of Tamaya recalibrating itself around her absence, the way water finds a new path around a fallen tree, slow at first, then suddenly as though it had never flowed any other way. A younger courtesan, Kosen, the same woman who took that slap from the drunken retainer back in early summer, rises to fill the rank Hanaogi vacated, and you watch her learn the doshu walk over several weeks of practice in the empty front room before dawn, stumbling at first on the tall lacquered clogs, the way the Kamuro once stumbled on the cobblestones, gradually finding the rolling figure-8 rhythm that took Hanaogi, presumably, just as many awkward private mornings to master back when she herself was younger than you are now. It's during this same stretch, on a night thick with the particular cold that arrives just before winter properly sets in, that Okio-san sends you on an errand you'd normally never be trusted with alone after dark, carrying a payment owed to a moneylender whose office sits just beyond the rear wall of the quarter, in the tangle of unlicensed streets you've glimpsed before, only through gaps in fence boards and never once actually walked. Straight there, straight back, she tells you, pressing the sealed paper packet into your hands along with a small lantern. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone who isn't the moneylender's clerk, and don't, under any circumstances, let anyone see what you're carrying. You go out through a side gate normally reserved for cart deliverers, and the moment you cross beyond the official boundary of the quarter, the difference hits you immediately, the way cold air hits you when you step out of a heated room. Inside the wall, even the poorest corner of Yoshiwara maintains some pretense of order. Lanterns hung at regular intervals, watchmen posted, a structure imposed from above that, whatever its cruelties, at least keeps the streets recognizably streets. Out here, beyond the moat, there is none of that. The lanes narrow into something closer to gaps between buildings than proper roads, mud thick and unmarked by any cart track, because nobody bothers maintaining roads nobody official is responsible for, and the only light comes from your own small lantern and the occasional sliver escaping through a gap in some hut's wall. The smell is different too, fouler in a way you didn't expect given how badly the moat itself already reeks by this season. An unwashed, hungry smell that has none of the perfumed incense layered over every difficulty inside the official quarter's walls. Women sit in doorways here without any lattice at all to frame them. No robes elaborate enough to suggest a single coin's worth of investment by any house, calling out to you in voices that have given up entirely on the practiced decorative tone Hanaogi and Kosen and every woman inside Tamaya have spent years perfecting. You walk faster, eyes fixed straight ahead, exactly the way you learned to walk past suspicious strangers on your very first errands 2 years ago. Except the stakes out here feel different, sharper. The kind of difference you can't fully name but can absolutely feel pressing against the back of your neck the entire length of the lane. A man falls into step behind you near the third turning, his footsteps matching your pace a beat too precisely to be coincidence, and you remember, distantly, something Genbei once said about footpads. Though Genbei was talking about the city proper and not this particular nameless stretch of unlicensed mud between two worse alternatives, you don't run. Running, you've heard enough times by now to half believe it as instinct rather than advice, only tells a predator that you're worth chasing. You walk faster instead, angling slightly toward the brighter stretch ahead where the moneylender's lantern, larger and steadier than your own, marks his door at the lane's far end, and the footsteps behind you close the gap by perhaps 2 strides before you reach that light, close enough that you can hear breathing now, ragged, impatient, and then you're at the door, knocking hard, calling out the password phrase Okio-san made you repeat 3 times before you left, and the door opens just wide enough to let you through, and the footsteps behind you stop abruptly at the very edge of the lantern's reach. The man who'd been following simply melting backward into the dark the moment a witness became possible. You deliver the packet with hands that won't quite stop shaking, the clerk barely glancing at you as he counts the contents and stamps a receipt, and you walk back the way you came with the empty lantern held high, every shadow along that narrow lane suddenly looking exactly like the shape of a man who might be waiting in it, though none of them turn out to be. You don't tell Okio-san about the footsteps when you return. There seems no point. The errand was completed, the packet delivered, the receipt produced, and in the accounting that actually governs this house, the only ledger entry that matters is the one showing the debt paid, not the one showing how close, by some small unmeasured margin, you came to becoming a story someone else might one day tell a frightened new boy in an attic room. A cautionary tale about exactly the kind of fate of Fuji warned you waited for the 99 women nobody writes ballads about, except this time wearing your own face instead of hers. The second winter of your apprenticeship arrives harder than the first, or perhaps you simply remember the first one less clearly, the way every difficult season eventually blurs at the edges once enough time has passed since living through it. The rain barrel freezes solid most mornings now, and you've learned the precise angle to strike it with the heel of your hand that breaks the ice cleanest, without splashing icy water up your own sleeve, a small efficiency Matsu watches you perform every morning with the same careful attention you once paid to Tora's example, though you've never once thought to call it a lesson when you're the one teaching it. The moat itself freezes too, in the coldest stretch of the new year, a rare enough event that word spreads through the whole quarter within hours, and Okio-san, in a mood softened by the season's slower trade, and perhaps by some private accounting of her own that you'll never be privy to, allows you and Matsu a full afternoon free to go see it for yourselves. You stand at the edge with a dozen other wakaimono from a dozen other houses, all of you released on the same rare half-holiday, and watch grown men in their good clothes walking carefully out onto ice thick enough, apparently, to hold their weight, vendors having already set up small braziers right there on the frozen surface to sell roasted chestnuts to anyone curious enough to risk the crossing. Matsu goes first, tentative, sliding on the soles of his sandals the way you remember doing yourself once with Tora. Both of you laughing and laughing harder each time you fall, the cold of the ice biting straight through your thin winter coat every time you land on it. And for one entire afternoon, the wall and the moat and the debt and the contract all recede into something almost forgettable. Two boys sliding across frozen water exactly the way any two boys anywhere in the world might do, regardless of which side of which wall they happen to call home. The new year itself brings its own small ceremonies. The house swept thoroughly top to bottom in the days before. Fresh pine branches set at the entrance. A brief formal gathering where Okio-san distributes small gifts to the household staff in recognition of another year's service. Gifts calibrated precisely to rank the way every other gesture in this quarter seems to be calibrated to rank. Kosen receiving something far finer than what reaches the kitchen women, who in turn receive something finer than what reaches you and Matsu down at the household's lowest rung. Your own gift this year is a pair of new sandals, sturdy, properly fitted, the kind that won't soak through within the first hour of a rainy errand the way your old pair has been doing for months. Okio-san hands them to you without ceremony, the same flat efficiency she applies to every other transaction in her ledger. "You've done well this past year," she says, which from her counts as considerable praise, delivered in the same tone she might use to note that a shipment of silk had arrived undamaged. "Better than most boys at your stage. You think before you act mostly, which is rarer than it should be in someone your age. Keep it up, and there may be more for you here than carrying trays eventually. You think about what more might mean, given everything you've watched this house do to the people who climb its internal ranks, and you find the prospect carries less straightforward appeal than it might have carried 18 months ago, when you first arrived knowing nothing at all about what this quarter actually cost the people who succeed within it as thoroughly as the people who fail. Still, you take the sandals and you bow the correct depth, and you say the correct words of thanks, because whatever your private reservations, a contract is a contract, and Okio-san's good opinion remains for now the single most practical asset available to you inside these walls. You've noticed yourself watching the house differently these days, the way Hanogi once must have watched it, the way Ofuji clearly still watches it from her wig shop decades after leaving the working side of the trade behind entirely. You notice which guests tip generously, and which ones complain about every charge no matter how fair, which Kamuro are being trained gently, and which ones flinch the particular way that tells you, without needing details, exactly what kind of household discipline they're enduring behind closed doors. You notice the precise moment each evening when the lanterns shift the whole street from its tired daytime self into the performance everyone outside the wall actually pays to see. And you notice, too, the precise moment each morning when that performance gets quietly folded away again. Robes hung to air, powder wiped clean, the whole elaborate machinery of beauty disassembled and stored until the next evening calls for it to be built back up from nothing. You are 16 years old now, taller than when you arrived. Your shoulders broader from 2 years of carrying trays and water, and once, memorably, a 6-year-old child down a burning staircase. Your hands permanently marked with the fine white lines that come from years of cold water against cracked skin, and somewhere in all of that slow accumulation, without any single day announcing the change, you have stopped being the boy who flinched at the great gate's bronze hour bell, and become someone the new boy now watches the same careful way you once watched Tora. It is not, you think, exactly the man your father imagined when he signed the contract that brought you here. It is also not exactly the man Fuji warned you this place might make of you, the second kind, indifferent to the cruelty surrounding him because the cruelty has simply become wallpaper after enough repeated exposure. You are perhaps something closer to a third kind and nobody specifically warned you about. A person who has seen exactly what this quarter does to everyone trapped inside its wall, the powerful and the powerless alike, and decided deliberately day after day to keep noticing it rather than let it dissolve into background the way the cicadas dissolve into silence by midsummer. Whether that decision will hold once your own contract finally ends, once you walk out through the great gate the same way Tora did, a free man with nothing left to prove to Okio-san's ledger, you genuinely don't know yet. You suppose nobody ever quite knows that about themselves in advance. You suppose that's simply one more thing this quarter, like every difficult place in the world, leaves you to discover only once you're finally standing safely outside it, looking back through whatever gap remains between the version of yourself you used to be and the version this place has slowly, patiently, irreversibly made of you instead. A letter arrives for you in early spring, which is itself enough of an event to be remarked upon by half the household, since nobody has ever once written to a wakaimono at Tamaya in living memory, and Okio-san hands it over with visible curiosity she's too proud to voice directly, watching you closely as you break the simple seal. It's from Hanaoji, delivered by way of a Fuji's shop, since a former courtesan now living respectably as a merchant's wife in the northern provinces has no proper channel for writing directly to an apprentice still bound inside the quarter's walls, and the wig-maker, it turns out, has remained one of the very few people Naogi still trusts enough to use as a go-between. The letter itself is short, her handwriting more practised and elegant than you would have guessed, though you suppose 15 years of careful training touched every part of her, not only the parts visible to a paying audience. She writes that her husband treats her with more gentleness than she expected, that the northern winters are colder than anything Edo prepared her for, that she has begun, slowly, to forget the particular weight of the outer robe she once wore every single evening, though she suspects she will never entirely forget the rolling figure-eight step of the dochu, her body having learned it so thoroughly that she sometimes catches herself walking that way still, without meaning to, crossing an ordinary market street in an ordinary provincial town as though a crowd of admirers might be watching from behind lattice windows that don't actually exist there. She asks after the Kamuro who used to stumble, and after Okio-san, and after you specifically by name, hoping that whatever this place has continued doing to you in her absence, you've managed to keep some part of yourself separate from it the way she once urged you to. You read the letter twice, then a third time, standing in the courtyard with Matsu peering curiously over your shoulder until you fold it away into your sleeve, next to the plain, undecorated comb you've carried there nearly every day since the morning she left, and you find yourself, for reasons you don't examine too closely, more moved by this short, practical letter about northern winters than you were by any single moment of her lantern-lit processions. However many times those processions stopped your breath in your chest, you write back eventually with help from one of the kitchen women who can shape characters more elegantly than you can manage on your own. A short reply telling her that the Kamuro has grown 2 inches and stopped stumbling, that Okio-san remains exactly as efficiently terrifying as ever, that you yourself are 16 now and taller than you were, and that you have so far managed to keep at least some part of yourself separate from what this place wants to make of every boy who passes through its gate. You don't know if the letter ever reaches her properly, given the uncertain chain of hands it has to pass through to cross that particular distance, but you send it anyway, because some gestures matter for their own sake regardless of whether they land exactly where intended, the same way Ofuji's warnings mattered, and Genbei's careful watch from the fire tower mattered, and the old woman's words on the tea-house balcony in Asakusa mattered. Small kindnesses passed from person to person, across a quarter that otherwise runs almost entirely on debt and obligation, and the careful, exhausting arithmetic of figuring out exactly how small you need to make yourself to survive another evening behind these particular walls. It happens again in late summer, nearly 2 years to the week since the fire that took Tamaya's first incarnation, and the nameless girl along with it, a kitchen fire this time, caught early, contained within minutes by a bucket line that has clearly drilled this exact scenario more than once since the rebuild. Nobody is hurt. The damage amounts to a scorched wall and a ruined batch of rice. But the fire bell rings all the same, sharp and fast and utterly distinct from the hour bell, and your whole body responds to that sound now with a memory it didn't have 2 years ago. Heart hammering, palms suddenly damp, the smell of smoke, however faint, immediately summoning the specific image of a small girl, curled, frozen in the corner of a room with flame visible through her paper screen. You're up the stairs within seconds, checking doors, the same instinct that sent you wrenching at a bolted side door 2 years ago, driving you now toward the same rear corridor. Except this time, when your hand reaches the side door's iron bar, you find it already standing open, unbolted, swinging loose on its hinge. You stand there a moment, confused, before you remember. You did this yourself 3 months ago, quietly, without making any particular announcement of it, having finally worked up the nerve to raise the matter with Okio-san directly on a slow afternoon, when her mood seemed unusually patient. The side door, you'd said, careful with your phrasing, having rehearsed it twice in your head before approaching her. During the fire 2 years ago, it was bolted and I couldn't get it open, and I've wondered since whether a different kind of latch, one a person could release faster in a panic, might be worth the cost. You'd expected her to dismiss the idea outright, or worse, to ask pointed questions about exactly why a wakaimono felt entitled to suggest changes to the house's security arrangements. Instead, she'd gone quiet for a long moment, her abacus beads still under her fingers, and then nodded once, briskly, the same way she nods at any other expense she's decided is worth the money. Speak to the carpenter when he comes for the autumn repairs. Tell him I authorized it. You never learned whether she made that decision out of genuine concern for what happened to the girl with no proper name, or out of pure practical risk management, having calculated that a house known for losing workers to a bolted door during a fire might struggle to recruit replacement labour in the future, or out of some private grief of her own that she'd simply never once let show on her face in 2 full years, since that morning standing in front of the smoking ruin. Perhaps it was some mixture of all three. Perhaps you've come to understand almost every decision made inside these walls is some mixture of genuine feeling and cold calculation. The two so thoroughly entangled by now in everyone who works here that even Akio-san herself might struggle to separate one motive cleanly from the other. Whatever the reason, the door swings open easily tonight. No bolt to wrestle with. No panic compounding panic the way it did 2 years ago. And the small kitchen fire is contained without a single person trapped behind a barrier that someone weeks earlier decided mattered more than 30 seconds of a frightened person's safety. You stand in the cleared corridor afterward, breathing hard from nothing more strenuous than the climb up the stairs, and you find yourself, for the first time since arriving at this quarter, feeling something that resembles genuine pride rather than mere relief. A quiet certainty that one specific danger, however small a fraction of the larger machinery of cruelty and debt that runs this whole place, is now slightly less dangerous than it used to be. Because you noticed it and said something about it, and someone with the authority to act on it decided your noticing was worth acting upon. It is not, you understand clearly, anything close to fixing what this quarter actually is. The contracts remain. The debts remain. The lattice windows still display women like merchandise every single evening, and somewhere beyond this house's walls, in houses you'll never see the inside of, other bolted doors almost certainly still wait for their own future fire to prove exactly how dangerous a 30-second delay can become. But it is something, a single small correction, made because one boy who once carried a frightened child down a burning staircase couldn't quite let the memory of that locked bolt settle into background the way Ofuji warned you. Everything else in this quarter eventually does. You think, standing there in the cleared corridor with the smell of scorched rice, still drifting faintly from the kitchen, that this might be the closest thing to an answer you'll ever get to the question Ofuji posed that first morning, all those months ago, about which kind of man this place would eventually finish making of you. Not the gentle kind who simply absorbs every cruelty without adding to it, passive, unchanged, merely surviving. Not the cruel kind who learns to wield this place's logic of debt and rank and small humiliation against the next person weaker than himself. Something quieter than either. Something that notices and remembers, and occasionally, when the opportunity actually presents itself, acts. The third autumn of your contract arrives quietly, without any single dramatic event to mark its beginning. The willow leaves along Nakanocho turning their familiar tired yellow exactly the way they did the autumn before, and the autumn before that, as though the trees themselves have agreed to ignore whatever burned down and got rebuilt beneath their branches in the meantime. Matsu has grown enough over the past year and a half that he no longer flinches at every loud noise, though he still ducks instinctively whenever Okio-san's voice sharpens unexpectedly, a habit you suspect every boy who serves in this house carries for at least the first 2 years, regardless of how settled he otherwise becomes. You've started teaching him the things Tora once taught you, which loose floorboard creaks loud enough to wake a sleeping guest, which suppliers can be bargained down a fraction without causing offence, how to read the particular quality of silence that means Okio-san is simply tired, rather than the heavier silence that means she's genuinely displeased about something specific. On a quiet evening in late autumn, the kind with no procession scheduled and few enough guests that the whole house settles into an unusually relaxed hush well before midnight, you find yourself sitting with Matsu in the narrow kitchen passage after the last trays have gone up, both of you finishing the cold remains of the evening's rice rather than letting it go to waste. And he asks you, with the particular bluntness only a boy who hasn't yet learned to be careful with his questions can manage, whether you ever think about leaving. Every apprentice thinks about leaving, you tell him. Thinking about it and actually doing it are different matters entirely. Tora left. Tora's contract ended. That's different from leaving. Would you stay if your contract ended and Okio-san offered you something more? You said once she mentioned there might be more for you here than carrying trays. You consider the question longer than you expect to, turning your half-empty rice bowl slowly between your palms, feeling the rough grain of unglazed pottery against fingers that have grown harder and more calloused than they were when you first arrived, carrying nothing but a sack of barley and a debt that was never properly yours. I don't know yet, you say finally, which is the honest answer, even though Matsu's face suggests he was hoping for something more decisive. I think I'd want to do something that helps people the way Ofuji helps people at her wig shop, or the way Genbei helps people up on the watchtower, watching for trouble before it spreads too far to stop. Something that lets me stay near this place, since it's the only world I properly know anymore, without asking me to keep being part of the parts of it I don't think I could keep watching forever. Like the bolt on the side door, like the bolt on the side door, you agree. Somewhat surprised that he'd connected the two things himself, though perhaps you shouldn't be, given how thoroughly that single small change has apparently entered the house's collective memory over the past year, repeated by kitchen women and senior attendants alike as a small, quiet point of pride whenever the subject of the old fire comes up. Matsu finishes his rice and sets the bowl aside. Quiet for a moment in the particular way that means he's working up the nerve to say something he's been holding on to for a while. I used to think, before I came here, that being scared of something meant you were weak, he says eventually. My father used to say that. That fear was for children and women, and a man simply did the thing regardless of how he felt about it. What do you think now? I think everyone here is scared of something. Okio-san is scared of the ledger not balancing. Kosen is scared of guests like the one who hit her last summer. You were scared of that bolted door, clearly, given how much trouble you went to changing it. I don't think being scared makes anyone weak. I think it just means you're paying attention to something real. You think about a Fuji's warning, the two kinds of men this quarter manufactures, and you wonder whether there might in fact be a fourth kind nobody's bothered naming yet. A boy who arrives frightened and stays frightened in all the right ways, channeling that fear into noticing rather than letting it curdle into either passive numbness or active cruelty. And you wonder, watching Matsu's face in the dim kitchen lamplight, whether he might turn out to be exactly that kind himself, given enough time and enough careful examples to learn from. You're paying more attention than I gave you credit for, you tell him. And he ducks his head, embarrassed by the compliment in the particular way boys his age always seem to be embarrassed by sincerity. And the two of you finish clearing the kitchen passage in companionable silence, the lanterns outside still glowing faintly through the thin paper screens, the last few guests of the evening murmuring somewhere upstairs, the whole house settling slowly, the way it settles every single night, into whatever fragile peace this particular quarter manages to construct for itself between one day's labour and the next. On quiet nights like this one, after the shop has closed and the last lantern along the kitchen passage has been trimmed down to a low, steady flame, you sometimes sit by the small window in the back room and watch what little you can see of the street go dark beyond the wall. The watchmen make their rounds along Nakanocho, their footsteps slow and deliberate, calling the hour in voices pitched to carry without waking anyone who's actually managed to fall asleep. Candlelight glows faintly behind paper screens up and down the street. Houses settling into whatever rest they manage to find between one evening's performance and the next morning's labour. Somewhere, faintly, a shamisen is still being played, slow and unhurried, the kind of music that belongs to the hours after the paying guests have gone quiet, and only the women themselves remain awake, playing for no audience but each other and whatever private thoughts the night brings with it. You think, on nights like this, about everyone you've come to know inside these walls and just beyond them. Of Fuji, sorting hair by colour and length in her small shop on Kiyomachi, telling you 40 years' worth of warnings disguised as idle conversation because nobody else in the quarter has the patience to listen to her anymore. Genbei, up on the rebuilt watchtower, scanning the dark rooftops for the first orange flicker that might mean another fire is beginning somewhere nobody's noticed yet, doing the same patient job he's apparently done for decades, mostly, as he once told you himself, for nights when nothing happens at all. Hanaogi, somewhere far north now, walking an ordinary market street in her husband's province, with a dochu step her body refuses to forget, writing letters about cold winters and asking after a Kamuro who finally learned to stop stumbling. The old woman on the tea house balcony in Asakusa, who told you the wall was never as tall as it felt from inside. That what truly kept her there for 40 years wasn't timber and stone at all, but debt and habit and not knowing where else in the world to go. The girl with no proper name, registered only by a number assigned 6 weeks before the fire that took her, whose voice through a thin wall was the very first thing you ever properly heard inside this quarter, before you'd even learned to recognize the particular smell of cold ash and old face powder that announces every single morning here. You think about what you've actually seen across nearly 3 years now behind this wall and this moat. The lanterns going up each evening, transforming tired wooden buildings into something briefly resembling a woodblock print come to life. The lattice windows where women hold practiced expressions through every crude joke a stranger cares to make about which face he'd choose if he had the coin. The processions, slow and deliberate, weighed down by robes that cost more than most farmers see in a decade, performed nightly until the miracle of it stops registering as miracle to anyone forced to watch it that many times in a row. The fire and the bolted door and the child you carried down a smoke-filled staircase because nobody else happened to be close enough to reach her first. This quarter holds every kind of person and every kind of cruelty, and occasionally every kind of unexpected kindness too, often from people who have the least reason in the world to spare any kindness at all. It grinds some people down toward nothing, the way it ground down the girl whose name you never learned. It lifts others toward something resembling freedom, the way it eventually lifted Hanaoji, against every reasonable expectation, into a quiet provincial life with a husband gentle enough to deserve her. The difference between those two outcomes, as far as you've been able to determine across 3 years of close observation, comes down mostly to luck and timing, and which particular stranger happens to fall in love with which particular face on which particular evening. Factors that have absolutely nothing to do with merit or effort or the quality of anyone's character. You've been lucky so far, you think, turning the thought over carefully the way you might turn over a coin to check both sides of it. A house that, however harsh its discipline, eventually fixed the bolt you asked it to fix. A Yarit whose cruelty runs mostly toward efficiency rather than genuine malice. Your health, intact across 3 winters of cracked hands and 1 terrifying night of smoke and flame. Your prospects, whatever they ultimately turn out to be, at least still open, still undecided, still yours to shape, rather than already foreclosed by debt or disaster, the way they were foreclosed for so many other people you've watched pass through this quarter during your time here. Not everyone can say the same. You understand that more clearly now than you did the day you first arrived, frightened and green, knowing nothing yet about lattice windows or hour bells or the particular weight of carrying someone smaller and more frightened than yourself toward whatever safety you could manage to find for both of you. Tomorrow there will be more trays to carry, more lattice wood to scrub clean by cold rain barrel light, more errands threading the narrow space between the official quarter and whatever lies beyond its wall. The endless quiet labour that keeps this whole strange, beautiful, brutal machine running another day, another season, another year. But tonight you're simply tired, in the particular way that comes from a long day's work properly finished rather than from anything left undone. And the shamisen somewhere down the street has finally gone quiet too, and the watchman's footsteps have faded toward the far end of Nakanocho, and the small window in the back room shows nothing now but darkness and the faint outline of rooftops you've come to know better than you ever knew the rooftops of the village where you were born. You climb up to the attic later than usual that night, after sitting with your own thoughts in the dark kitchen passage longer than you meant to, and Matsu is already asleep on his side of the thin mattress, breathing slow and even, one arm flung loose across the worn blanket the way younger boys sleep when exhaustion finally overtakes whatever worry kept them awake earlier in the evening. The attic room is cold, the way it always is by this point in autumn, a thin draught finding its way through the same small gap in the boards that has let cold air through every single night you've slept here for nearly 3 years now. You've stopped noticing it as discomfort. It has simply become part of the room's particular character, the way the creak on the 4th stair has become part of the house's particular voice, the way the smell of cold ash and old face powder has become, for you, simply the smell of morning rather than anything worth remarking on. You lie down without bothering to remove your work coat, too settled into the day's tiredness to think much about comfort, and you pull the thin blanket up to your chin and stare for a while at the dark ceiling beams above you. The same beams you stared at your very first night here. 3 years younger, and a great deal more frightened than you are now. It's strange, you think, the particular person you've become inside this house, inside this whole walled quarter that felt, on your first morning, like the entire boundary of the known world, and now feels, since that afternoon on the tea-house balcony in Asakusa, like one small fence among countless others, visible from a sufficient height as nothing more than a single thin dark line cutting across a much larger picture. You're not the boy who arrived here with a sack of barley and a debt that was never properly his own. That boy flinched at every loud noise, got lost on every unfamiliar corner, didn't yet know the difference between the hour bell and the fire bell, didn't yet know which suppliers could be bargained down without causing offence, or which loose floorboard creaked loud enough to wake a sleeping guest. That boy is still in here somewhere, you think, the way you can sometimes still feel him stir whenever something genuinely unexpected happens. A sudden loud noise, an unfamiliar face at the gate, the particular smell of smoke catching you off guard in a doorway that has nothing actually burning behind it. But he isn't in charge anymore. The person in charge now is someone who carried a 6-year-old down a smoke-filled staircase without being ordered to. Someone who noticed a bolted door and found the nerve, eventually, to ask that it be changed. Someone who teaches a younger boy the things Tora once taught him, patiently, the way patience itself was eventually taught to him by people who had far less reason to extend it than he ever properly deserved. Your mother, were she somehow able to see you now, would barely recognize the way you talk, quarter slang threading through every other sentence without your noticing it any more. The particular rolling cadence of speech that marks anyone who spent real time inside this district's walls. She'd barely recognize the way you move through a crowded street without flinching, the way you can look at a bolt of fabric or a wig or a stranger's face approaching down a dark unlicensed lane and read in seconds information that would have taken you months to gather properly when you first arrived. She would be proud, you think, probably, though you'll likely never get the chance to find out for certain, given how far the village sits from anything resembling your present life, and how rarely letters manage to travel that particular distance with any reliability at all. They sent you here with nothing but a debt and a hope that the city would somehow make something useful of you. The way every family in your village seemed to believe the city eventually made something useful of every son sent away to settle a family's accounts. So far, that hope has paid off, more or less, though not at all in the shape anyone back home likely imagined when they sent you off with your barley sack and your spare loincloth. You're learning a trade of a kind, though it has very little to do with fabric or wigs or any honest commerce in the ordinary sense. You are learning instead how to notice cruelty without becoming numb to it, how to extend small kindnesses inside a system built almost entirely to discourage them, how to survive a place that swallows so many people whole while still managing somehow to remain recognizably yourself underneath whatever the place insists on adding to you. In a quarter that eats so many people alive, slowly or quickly, by debt or by fire, simply remaining recognizably yourself is no small accomplishment. You understand that now in a way you couldn't have understood it on your first frightened morning here, 3 years and 1 burned down building ago. Before sleep finally takes you, your mind drifts back, the way it sometimes does on quiet nights, to a particular guest from earlier this same season, a man whose visit taught you something you didn't expect to learn from someone who spends his own working life, by his own account, doing nothing but pretending to be other people in front of a paying crowd. He was a kabuki actor, reasonably well known beyond the wall, famous enough that 2 attendants had to manage the small crowd that gathered outside Tamaya, simply hoping to catch sight of him arriving. He requested Kosen specifically, having seen her perform the doshu only twice since she rose to her new rank, and you were the one sent up with his sake that evening, expecting, given everything you'd learned about wealthy and famous guests over 3 years of careful observation, some version of careless entitlement dressed up in expensive robes. Instead, you found a man sitting quietly on the floor cushion, watching Kosen arrange the tea things with an attention that had nothing performative in it at all. The studied stillness of someone whose entire profession depends on noticing precisely how other people move, what their hands do when they think nobody important is watching, how a person's true feeling leaks out at the edges of whatever practiced expression they're currently performing. "You're the boy who carried the Kamuro down the stairs during the fire," he said. Not quite a question, as you set the tray down carefully between them. "Word travels even outside the wall, you know. There was a print made of it, did you hear? Quite popular for a season. The hero of Tamaya, they called the figure in it, though I don't suppose the artist ever learned your actual name to put beneath the image." You hadn't heard. You found, oddly, that you didn't much care either way, the print itself meaning considerably less to you than the simple fact of the girl having survived at all. It wasn't anything especially brave, you told him. I just happened to be the one close enough to reach the door. He studied you for a long moment with the same careful attention he'd been giving Kosen's hands a moment earlier. That's precisely the kind of thing a genuinely brave person says about himself afterward. The cowards always have a much better story ready, full of decisive action and clear thinking under pressure. The truly brave ones mostly just remember being frightened and doing the obvious thing anyway because somebody smaller needed it done. Kosen, pouring the tea now with hands that had finally stopped trembling whenever a stranger's praise turned in your direction, glanced up at you with something like quiet amusement at how thoroughly uncomfortable the actor's compliment was clearly making you. "I play heroes on stage 4 or 5 times a season," the actor continued, accepting his cup from Kosen with a small, genuine nod of thanks, rather than the offhand entitlement you'd half expected. "Warriors, loyal retainers, the occasional tragic lover willing to die for some impossible point of honour. The audience weeps every single time, convinced they're watching something true about courage. But it's only ever a story, built from gesture and timing and a playwright's careful arrangement of words. What you did on that staircase wasn't a story at all. It was simply a boy doing the only thing available to him in a moment when doing nothing would have meant something far worse." I find that considerably more moving than anything I've managed to perform myself in 15 years on the stage, though I'd be lying if I claimed the audience's tears don't still feel good regardless." He laughed then, at his own honesty, a low, easy sound that had none of the careful performance you might have expected even from his laughter, and the rest of the evening passed in a way you found yourself, afterward, remembering fondly rather than simply enduring, the actor asking genuine questions about the house's daily routines, about Okio-san's ledger and Ofuji's wig baskets, about the particular grain of the lattice wood and how often it needed cleaning, seemingly fascinated by the unglamorous machinery operating just beneath the surface of the illusion he himself was paying handsomely to enjoy for one evening. Before he left, well past midnight, he pressed an extra coin into your palm at the door, not a large sum, nothing close to what he'd already paid the house itself, but more than any single guest had ever once thought to give a wakaimono directly. "For the staircase," he said simply. "Not because you need paying for it, because some things deserve acknowledging even when they were never done for the sake of being acknowledged." You think of him now, lying in the dark attic with Matsu's steady breathing beside you, and you find yourself smiling slightly at the memory, the small unexpected kindness of a famous stranger who spends his professional life pretending to be other people, choosing, for one quiet evening inside these walls, simply and entirely to be himself. You think too of Genbei, who told you once on a cold winter night that he'd never managed to see Mount Fuji from the watchtower, despite swearing he'd looked for it on every clear night across more years of service than he could be bothered counting precisely. He retired from the post this past spring, his eyes finally too weak for the careful work of scanning dark rooftops for the first orange flicker that distinguishes a beginning disaster from an ordinary dying cooking fire, and the house held a small quiet gathering in his honour on his final evening of duty, the kind of modest send-off this quarter rarely bothers extending to anyone below the rank of a celebrated courtesan or a generous patron. You climbed the ladder one last time with him that night, the way you used to climb it with Tora, except this time it was simply the two of you, no sake flask needed as an excuse, both of you looking out over the same view that had stopped your breath the very first time you saw it. 41 years, Genbei said, leaning against the railing with the particular ease of a man who has spent so many nights in exactly this position that his body has long since memorized every angle of it. 41 years watching rooftops for smoke, and in all that time I caught maybe a dozen fires early enough that my warning actually mattered, that the alarm went up fast enough to save a building that would otherwise have been lost. A dozen out of countless thousands of ordinary nights when nothing happened at all and nobody ever thanked me for the nothing, because nobody properly notices a disaster that never gets the chance to occur. That seems like it should matter more than it apparently does, you said. A dozen buildings saved. That's a dozen households that didn't end up like Tamaya did 2 summers back. It matters to me, he admitted. Doesn't always feel like it matters to anyone else. Watching a man stand on a platform doing nothing visible most nights of his working life. But you're young yet, and you'll learn this eventually if you haven't already started learning it, that most of the genuinely important work in this world looks exactly like nothing happening, right up until the single night it very much isn't nothing at all, and then everyone suddenly remembers to be grateful that someone was paying proper attention the whole time nobody else thought to look. He gestured out toward the western horizon, where the clouds had finally, that particular evening, thinned enough to show a faint pale shape against the darkening sky, unmistakable even at this distance, the mountain he'd spent 41 years failing to properly see from this exact spot. "There," he said, quiet, almost reverent in a way you'd never once heard from him before. 41 years, and there it finally is on my very last night up here. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, if it's supposed to mean anything at all. Probably it doesn't mean a single thing beyond simple coincidence and unusually clear weather, but I'll take it as a small kindness regardless, since I've earned the right to take it however I please at this point in my life." You stood beside him a long while, watching the pale shape of the mountain hold steady against the darkening sky, until the last light finally faded and the shape dissolved back into ordinary darkness, indistinguishable from the clouds that usually hid it, and you thought, watching him watch it, about everything this quarter had asked of him across 41 years of careful, mostly invisible labour, and about how rarely anyone inside these walls gets properly thanked for the disasters that, because of their quiet attention, never quite managed to happen. His replacement on the tower is younger, sharper-eyed, properly trained by Genbei himself over several months before the old man's final retirement, and you've climbed up once or twice since to sit with him too, the way you once sat with Genbei, though it isn't quite the same yet. The new man's watch lacking the particular weathered patience that only comes from decades spent doing the same, careful, mostly unrewarded work, night after night, fire after rare fire, for a quarter that depends entirely on people like him without ever quite managing to say so out loud. You think, finally, of the plain comb still tucked into the lining of your sleeve, carried there nearly every day since the morning Hanaugi pressed it into your palm and walked toward her waiting palanquin without once looking back. You've never quite decided what to do with it, whether to keep it as a private memento for the remainder of your own contract, or to pass it along someday to whichever new boy or new Kamuro seems most in need of a small, wordless reminder that kindness inside this quarter, however rare, is never actually impossible, only difficult, and that difficulty has never once been a sufficient reason to stop attempting it. Matsu asked you about the comb once, curious in the particular way he asks about most things lately, turning it carefully over in his own hands when you finally showed it to him, tracing the plain, undecorated wood with one finger, as though it might tell him something about its previous owner that words alone couldn't quite manage. "Will you give it to someone eventually?" he'd asked, "the way she gave it to you?" "Probably," you told him, taking it back gently and tucking it once more into your sleeve. "Not yet, though. I think I need to carry it a while longer first, until I'm certain I understand properly what it's meant to remind me of." He'd nodded, satisfied with that answer, in the particular way only a boy still young enough to trust that adults generally know what they're doing can manage, and the two of you had gone back to your evening's work without discussing it further, though you've noticed since that conversation that he watches the comb's small shape beneath your sleeve sometimes during quiet moments, the way you once watched Tora's hands work a familiar knot, learning without quite realizing yet that he's learning anything at all. You think briefly, too, of your own father, 2 days' walk northeast of here, bent over the same flooded rice paddy he was bent over the morning you left, having no real way of knowing whether his son still has all his fingers, let alone whether his son has carried a stranger's frightened child down a burning staircase, or argued, however carefully, for a safer bolt on a side door, or been handed a 15-year-old comb by the most celebrated courtesan this house has produced in a generation. You wonder sometimes whether he thinks of you at all on ordinary evenings, or whether the debt that brought you here settled itself so thoroughly into the ordinary rhythm of his own life that your absence has simply become, for him, another unremarkable feature of the landscape, the way the wall and the moat have become, for you, simply the unremarkable boundary of your own daily world. You decide, lying here in the dark with that thought turning over slowly in your tired mind, that it doesn't much matter either way. You're not doing any of this for his benefit, not any more, whatever debt originally brought you through that gate. You are doing it now for reasons that have grown entirely your own across 3 winters of cracked hands and 1 terrible night of smoke, reasons that have far less to do with settling an old family obligation and far more to do with the particular specific person you have slowly, almost without noticing, become. That thought settles something in your chest that has been faintly unsettled, you realize, for longer than you'd consciously understood until just this moment, and with it settled, sleep finally arrives in full, no longer held back by any last stray thread of waking thought. Outside, beyond the small attic window, beyond the thin gap in the boards that lets the cold draft through every single night without exception, the quarter itself seems to settle along with you. Lantern after lantern, guttering low in house after house, up and down Nakanocho. The willow branches hanging motionless now, in air gone still and cold, the moat lying flat and dark beneath a sky finally clear enough, perhaps, for someone still awake on some rooftop platform to glimpse a pale mountain shape on the western horizon, the way Genbei finally glimpsed it after 41 years of patient, mostly unrewarded looking. You do not know, lying here, whether tonight is one of those rare clear nights. You don't get up to check. Some questions, you've learned, are better left for tomorrow's daylight to answer, when there's actual use to be made of the knowledge either way. Tonight there is only sleep, patient and complete, waiting the way it always waits, for every tired body in this crowded, beautiful, brutal quarter to finally stop resisting it. You think one last time before thought itself finally dissolves of the whole long chain of people who have passed through this attic before you and will pass through it again after you, each one arriving frightened and green, each one slowly learning the particular grammar of this place, which doors stick in winter, and which ones never quite latch properly in summer's damp heat, which footsteps on the stairs belong to Okio-san, and which belong to someone far less likely to notice a chore left half finished. You wonder whether any of those earlier boys ever lay in this exact spot, on some other night decades before your own birth, turning over the very same kind of tired, half-formed thoughts about debt and kindness, and the strange, slow work of staying recognizably yourself inside a place built to wear that self down to nothing. You suspect they did. You suspect, in fact, that this very wondering is itself part of the grammar this place teaches everyone who stays long enough to learn it properly. A small inherited ritual passed silently from one exhausted apprentice to the next. Regardless of whether either one ever learns the other's name, you let that thought settle, unresolved. The way most true things in this quarter remain permanently unresolved, neither fully comforting nor fully bleak, simply true, simply there, simply part of the weight and the grain of the place, the way the wood grain runs through every lattice bar you've ever scrubbed clean by cold morning light across 3 long years of mornings. The candle on the small shelf beside the window gutters low, its flame shrinking to a thin blue thread before finally going dark altogether, and the room fills with the particular soft completeness of true darkness, broken only by the faint grey edge of moonlight finding its way through the same small gap that lets the cold draft through, and by the muffled distant sounds of a quarter slowly settling itself toward whatever rest it manages between one day's labour and the next. Your eyes are heavy now, the day's walking and carrying and watching finally catching up with you all at once. The particular ache that settles into your legs and your shoulders by the end of every long shift. A pleasant kind of exhaustion despite everything. The ache of work properly finished rather than work left undone. Your mind, usually so busy noticing one detail after another, the way Ofuji notices hair, the way Genbei notices smoke, the way Okyo-san notices an unbalanced ledger from across an entire room, finally goes quiet, the endless chatter of small daily observations fading, slowly, into something closer to peace than you've managed to find most other nights this season. You think about the years still ahead of you, the 8 or 9 more months remaining on your contract before you, like Tora before you. Finally walk out through the great gate a free man, owing nothing to anyone, your debt settled the ordinary way, through years of labour rather than through fire or through some wealthy stranger's sudden infatuation. You think about what you might become when that day finally arrives. Perhaps something like a Fuji, staying near this quarter because it's the only world you properly know, helping in whatever small way the world allows from just outside its walls. Perhaps something else entirely, a path you can't yet picture clearly enough to name, the way you couldn't have pictured 3 years ago, the particular shape your life would take inside walls you hadn't yet learned existed. You cannot know which version of yourself you'll be at 20, at 30, at whatever age eventually finds you looking back on this exact night, the way you sometimes look back now on your very first night here, with a mixture of tenderness and disbelief at how little that earlier version of you understood about what was coming. Will you still be near this quarter, doing something useful from just outside its reach? Will you have found some other path entirely, through some other district, some other trade, some other version of the same essential choice between noticing and not noticing, between extending kindness and withholding it? Will you even still be alive, given how thoroughly this place has already demonstrated, twice now within your own memory, exactly how quickly fire can take everything a person thought was solid and permanent and turn it to char and smoke within a single terrible hour? You cannot know. Nobody can know that. Not really. Not even Okio-san with her ledgers and her decades of accumulated experience reading exactly which guests mean trouble and which suppliers mean honest dealing. The future stays as dark and unknowable as this attic room around you now, lit only by the thinnest grey edge of moonlight through a gap in old boards, the stars themselves hidden somewhere behind clouds and smoke, and the general haze that seems to hang permanently over a city this large, this crowded, this endlessly busy with the small daily business of 500,000 people, simply trying to get through their own particular version of a long day. But that uncertainty you've come to understand across 3 winters of cracked hands and 1 terrifying night of locked doors and orange light doesn't actually need fixing tonight. It is simply the shape the future takes for everyone, in every quarter, behind every wall, whether that wall is built of timber and stone the way Yoshiwara's is, or built instead of debt, or habit, or simply not knowing yet where else in the world a person might eventually choose to go. You have learned something this past year that nobody ever quite put into words for you directly. Not a Fuji with all her decades of hard-won warnings, not Hanaogi, with her careful, deliberate kindness disguised as casual conversation, not Genbei with his patient watch over rooftops that mostly, blessedly, never catch fire on any given ordinary night. You have learned simply that you can handle things, that the quarter which seemed, on your first frightened morning, like the entire and inescapable boundary of the known world, is in fact exactly what the old woman on the tea-house balcony told you it was, a fence no taller than any other fence, visible from sufficient height as nothing more than a thin dark line. However enormous and inescapable it continues to feel from down inside it on any ordinary difficult day. The boy who stepped through the great gate 3 years ago carrying a sack of barley and a debt that was never properly his own, the one who flinched at every unfamiliar noise and got lost on every unfamiliar corner and didn't yet know the smell of cold ash from the smell of old face powder. He is still somewhere inside you, you think, the way every earlier version of a person remains somewhere inside whatever they eventually become. You can still feel him stir sometimes, in moments of genuine surprise, in the particular catch of breath that happens whenever smoke reaches your nose unexpectedly in a doorway, with nothing actually burning behind it. But he is not in charge anymore. The person in charge now knows how to navigate a crowded street without flinching, knows how to read a bolted door and recognize the danger in it before anyone else in the household has thought to look, knows how to find his way home through dark, unlicensed lanes with a small lantern and a steady pace that doesn't invite the kind of attention that following footsteps in the dark are looking for. Someone who belongs here, in this exact, specific, complicated place, at least for the 8 or 9 months still remaining before some other version of belonging becomes possible somewhere else entirely. You are warm enough, under the thin blanket, despite the draught finding its way steadily through the gap in the boards. You're fed enough, on rice that was perhaps a little cold by the time you and Matsu finished it tonight, but filling all the same. You're safe enough, for tonight at least, in a house that has fixed at least one of the dangers that nearly cost you everything 2 summers ago, in a quarter that has rebuilt itself once already, and will likely have to rebuild itself again someday, the way every crowded wooden district eventually does, sooner or later, regardless of how many watchmen stand guard against it. You have a roof over your head, however thin its boards, and work that matters, in whatever small and complicated way the work of an apprentice errand boy can be said to matter, and people who are counting on you to show up tomorrow morning and do it all again, Matsu still learning which floorboards creak, Ukyo-san still balancing her endless ledger, the new lattice windows still needing their careful weekly cleaning before the next round of guests arrives, expecting an illusion that someone has to maintain by hand. That's more than a great many people in this quarter can honestly say for themselves. You think of the girl with no proper name, whose entire contract lasted only 6 weeks before the fire ended it for her permanently. You think of the women in the unlicensed district just beyond the rear wall, calling out in voices that gave up entirely on any practiced decorative tone, because nobody out there has the resources left to maintain illusions of any kind. You think of Kosen's bruised jaw and the Kamuro's bamboo switch legs, and all the small accumulated cruelties this quarter manufactures daily, almost as a byproduct of its own ordinary functioning, the way a kitchen produces ash along with whatever meal it's actually trying to cook. You are warm enough, fed enough, safe enough for tonight. That is enough. It has to be enough, because tonight is the only night you actually have, the only night anyone ever actually has, regardless of how much worry they spend trying to extend their grip into tomorrow or yesterday instead. The sounds of the quarter grow fainter now, around you and beneath you, and beyond the small attic window, the watchman's distant call fading toward the far end of Nakanocho, the shamisen long since gone quiet. The last guests of the evening presumably asleep now in whatever borrowed rooms they're paying to occupy until morning. Or perhaps you are simply listening less, the boundary between waking and proper sleep beginning to blur the particular way it always blurs when a body has decided firmly that consciousness is no longer strictly required for the night to continue properly without you. Somewhere out there, beyond this attic and this house and this whole walled quarter, Edo itself continues, the way it continues every single night regardless of who happens to be sleeping or waking or worrying inside any particular corner of it. The night watchmen walk their rounds through districts you've never once visited yourself. The unlicensed brothels just beyond the rear wall serve whatever desperate trade still finds its way to them after the licensed quarters' gates have closed for the night. The wholesalers sleep soundly in comfortable houses, dreaming perhaps of next season's profits, while the women whose labour generates those profits lie awake or asleep in rooms not nearly so comfortable, depending on which house happened to claim them and which patron, if any, happened to fall in love with the right face at the right moment. And you, Kichihei, son of a tenant farmer, apprentice errand boy of Tamaya, survivor of one terrible fire and witness to a great many smaller cruelties, this quarter produces almost without noticing them itself. You sink slowly into the darkness now, the way you do most nights, the way every tired body eventually does, regardless of what walls or debts or unresolved griefs happen to be waiting for it again come morning. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Tomorrow there will be lattice windows needing their careful weekly scrub, and trays needing careful carrying up creaking stairs, and errands threading the narrow, dangerous space between the official quarter and whatever waits just beyond its wall. Tomorrow there will be Matsu's questions, increasingly thoughtful, increasingly his own rather than simply borrowed from whatever you've taught him so far. Tomorrow there will be Okio-san's ledger and Ofuji's hair baskets, and Genbei's patient watch from the rebuilt tower, scanning rooftops for the first orange flicker that, with any luck at all, won't actually appear for a long while yet. But that is tomorrow. Right now there is only this, the softness of sleep finally reaching up to claim you properly, the particular quiet of an attic room that has held 3 full years of your life inside its thin walls, the steady, even breathing of the boy sleeping beside you, still young enough to flinch at sudden noises, but slowly, surely, learning not to. The distant, muffled heartbeat of a city of 500,000 people that never quite stops entirely, no matter how late the hour grows. You close your eyes. The last thing you properly hear before sleep takes you fully is the watchman's call somewhere far down Nakanocho, marking an hour you're far too tired tonight to bother counting. And then, gradually, nothing. Just the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, and the particular rest that comes only after a long day's labour has been properly, completely finished. Centuries will pass, though you have no way of knowing that tonight, lying here in this particular attic with this particular draught, finding its way through this particular gap in old boards. The Yoshiwara you know will eventually change beyond anything you'd recognise. The wooden lattice windows replaced by something else entirely. The moat filled in or paved over. The willow trees along Nakanocho cut down and replanted and cut down again, across however many generations follow this one. The great gate itself will eventually fall, rebuilt, fall again, the way every wooden structure in this whole flammable city eventually falls and rises and falls once more, the rhythm of fire and rebuilding so steady across the centuries that it becomes, in its own grim way, simply another season the city learns to expect and survive. But people will still live somewhere very much like this, still work somewhere very much like this, trading whatever they have, whether labour or beauty or simple patient attention, for whatever small security the world is willing to offer them in exchange. Still dream, in attic rooms not so different from this one, about lives larger than the walls currently containing them, the way you dreamed once, lying in a rice paddy beside your father, about a city you'd never yet seen and couldn't possibly have imagined accurately even if you'd tried. Some things don't change. Across however many centuries eventually pass between this exact night and whatever distant future finally arrives to replace it, the particular ache of a long day's honest labour doesn't change. The particular relief of a roof, however thin, standing firm between a tired body and the cold night air doesn't change. The need for rest, simple and complete, at the close of whatever difficult day a person has managed to survive, that need never seems to change at all, regardless of which century, which city, which particular wall happens to be standing around the person feeling it. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it has taken every tired apprentice who has ever slept in this attic before you, and every tired apprentice who will sleep here again after your own contract finally ends, and someone else's name fills the empty space beside whichever new boy eventually arrives to replace Matsu. The way Matsu replaced Tora, the way Tora replaced whoever came before him, an unbroken chain of frightened boys slowly becoming something steadier, stretching back further than anyone currently living in this quarter properly remembers. Let the noise of Nakanocho fade entirely now, the last watchman's call, the last distant note of an abandoned shamisen, the last faint murmur of guests settling into borrowed rooms for whatever remains of the night. Let the worry about tomorrow's contract, tomorrow's ledger, tomorrow's 8 remaining months of labour, let all of it soften, slowly, the way a tense muscle softens once the work that tensed it has finally, properly, been set down for the day. Let your thoughts slow and blur and gradually stop entirely, the way of Fuji's careful, sorting hands finally still themselves each evening, once the last basket of hair has been properly arranged, the way Genbei's patient watch finally hands itself over to the next man up the ladder, once his own long shift has run its course. You have earned this rest, the way every person who labours through a long, difficult, complicated day earns the particular peace that follows it, regardless of how much that day's labour was chosen freely or simply assigned by circumstances entirely beyond their own control. Take it now, fully, without reservation, the way you've learned slowly and at some cost to take whatever small mercies this quarter occasionally offers a person willing to notice them. And dream, if dreams come at all tonight, of whatever your tired mind decides to offer you, the wide grey river seen from a tea-house balcony in Asakusa, or the particular warmth of a comb pressed into your palm by someone who saw, in you, something other than the role this quarter assigned you, or simply nothing at all. The deep, dreamless, restorative dark that a body this thoroughly tired sometimes earns without needing any further story attached to it. Good night.